Hello, my name is Maria Aranda. I'm the Executive Director of the USC Edward R. Roybal Institute on Aging. We are very excited to welcome you to our third conference on interdisciplinary aging research to address health disparities in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. I'd like to share a bit about our conference series. We received a multi-year grant from the Institute on Aging Neurosciences Division in 2019 and held our very first in-person conference in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dorick Peck School of Social Work. The purpose of our project is threefold: to increase the diversity of underrepresented groups in the biomedical scientific workforce through training, mentorship, networking, and exposure to funding opportunities. Second, to increase grant applications to NIH for a more diverse scientific workforce, and to foment interdisciplinary and team-based research on health disparities and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Unlike years 1 and 2, where we invited senior scholars specializing in dementia research to present, today we pivot our format in order to show the innovative research conducted by our own cohort of scholars who have conducted amazing research and are ready to present their findings to us today. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Nora Manzanilla. Nora presented at our first conference installment and introduced her world to us as someone with the lived experience of caring for her mother, Señora Gladys Manzanilla. She represents the focal question that any scientist must acknowledge, which is why this matters.
For your hard work to address the research on aging and brain health and cognitive decline in unrepresented communities of color. Your efforts and your research directly obviously have a great impact on families like mine. And my mom is very lucky because I have, my sisters that are also engaged in the process, although I'm the primary because she lives here with me. I know that living here with me has made this happen. I've seen the facilities after facilities, and it was never a question for me to have my mom with me. But she still sings, enjoys music, enjoys taking her walks, looking at the cats and the squirrels outside. And we are still very blessed to have her in our lives. It is no joke that this is a tremendous amount of work, and I only wonder about the impact during COVID. So she's asking me where she is right now. So in the mornings, this is the routine. She does ask where she is, and then after breakfast, she settles into knowing where she is. Estás en la casa, okay? So again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope this is a great conference. I'm going to try to listen back in and out throughout the day because my sisters and I are very interested. So thank you so much.
Turning to our conference program, you will hear presentations from our inaugural scholars who represent 7 states, 10 disciplines, and 10 great minds that have made dementia health disparities their scientific missions.
Dr. Chanee Fabius is going to speak to us today about experiences among Medicare-Medicaid enrolled older adults with and without dementia. She is assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, and we welcome her this morning.
Great. Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. It's an honor to present after our hearing about the lived experience of caregivers. And I'm just going to share a bit about some ongoing work, looking at the associations between the use of paid help and care experiences among Medicare and Medicaid enrolled older adults with and without dementia. Just want to give acknowledgments to my mentorship team for this work, Dr. Jennifer Wolf here at Hopkins, Dr. Judy Casper, who passed away this summer, but was instrumental in the PI for the NHATS and NSOC data, and colleagues Sophia Okoye and John Mulcahy. This work is supported by a number of sources, including our Johns Hopkins AD Rickmar Center, as well as the Head Center here at Hopkins and the Health Disparities Center for Disparity Solutions. Okay, so there are roughly 7.4 million low-income older adults who are dually enrolled in both Medicare and Medicaid as of 2018. These dual enrollees are more likely than non-duals to be living with dementia. And about a quarter of them are, a quarter of older adults with dementia living in the community have Medicaid over the course of a year. Dual enrollees are more likely to report adverse consequences due to unmet need and participation restrictions and valued activities, and I'll discuss what I'm referring to when I talk about those in just a minute. And then duals may also receive long-term services and supports from family and unpaid caregivers, as well as paid help. The primary source of these supports is family and unpaid caregivers, but they also receive paid help. This is often financed by Medicaid, home, and community-based services. So what are LTSS? So for those who are less familiar with the term, LTSS, long-term services and supports, are defined as the services and supports needed by individuals of all ages with functional limitations and chronic illnesses who need assistance to perform routine daily activities such as bathing, dressing, preparing meals, and administering medications. LTSS covers the spectrum of services from home supports to nursing homes and end-of-life care, and my work focuses on home-based supports. So as I said, these services or supports are often provided by family and unpaid caregivers, but the paid help usually includes anything from homemaking and companion services, home health, home delivered meals, all the way to durable medical equipment. I should note that Medicare does not cover the costs of home and community-based services. These programs are usually administered through state Medicaid programs, and oftentimes families are left to pay for these services out of pocket. And so as a result of state rebalancing efforts, which is the effort to shift Medicaid funding from being institutionally biased as it has been in the past to being more so community and home and community-based focused, and providing services in the community to, number one, help keep people at home for as long as possible, as well as delay nursing home placement. There's been an increase in the access to home and community-based services, and this also creates opportunities and programs for vulnerable groups, such as those with dementia, to keep them in the community. The LTSS environment, which includes neighborhood disadvantage as well as generosity, which is the allocation of Medicaid long-term services and supports expenditures to home care services, likely contribute to the care experiences of dual enrollees with disabilities. But it's unclear whether there are differences in the care experiences by receipt of paid help and LTSS environment characteristics for older adults with and without dementia. And so we set out to understand the associations, and we had three hypotheses, which are all based on prior research. So the first is that dual enrollees who receive paid help will be more likely to report negative care experiences regardless of dementia status, and this is supported by prior work looking at paid help and experiences in caregivers. Dual enrollees living in neighborhoods with high neighborhood social disadvantage will more often report negative care experiences, and duals who are living in a state with high Medicaid HCBS generosity will less often report negative care experiences. And our study was based on the framing of the study is based on the Convoys of Care model, which was originally developed by Candace Kipp and used in assisted living to examine the multi-level contributors to individual experiences. So in our case, we are interested in looking at the care experiences of older adults, so adverse consequences of unmet need and participation restrictions. And the model proposes that there are multiple factors that are associated with those experiences. So individual and care arrangement influences, which include demographic information as well as the use of paid help. Neighborhood influences would be social deprivation, and then state policy influences include Medicaid, home and community-based service generosity. We use the 2011 to 2015 National Health and Aging Trend Study, NHATS, to create, the sample for the present study. We pooled data from waves 1 to 5. The study cohort includes 979 community dwelling older adults who were living in a traditional community setting. So that's folks who were not in a nursing home or a residential care setting such as assisted living. Also included people who were receiving help with self-care, mobility, or household activities, and people who report being enrolled in Medicaid either in 2011 or the subsequent interviews. And this enrollment was based on the participants' self-report. We created 2 dichotomous measures to examine adverse consequences due to unmet need, as well as participation restrictions and valued activities. So for self-care, for adverse consequences due to unmet need, we focus on self-care mobility related adverse consequences. And so participants who reported receiving help or having difficulty completing an activity were asked whether they experienced an adverse consequence due to no one being there to provide help or the activity being too difficult for them to complete on their own. So this could include going without eating, all the way to having to stay in bed because no one is available to help. And then for and so what we did is if people reported having any of these adverse consequences, they were categorized as having adverse consequences due to unmet need. Similarly, for participation restrictions, care recipients were asked to report whether each of the activities was important to them and whether they were unable to participate in the activity due to a health-related challenge. And so if you reported any difficulty or any inability to participate in the challenges, you were categorized as having a participation restriction. And so these are our measures of interest that also, so from the NHATS, the individual characteristics, we included dementia status, which is based on NHATS specific classification, use of paid help, age, gender, race, ethnicity, all the way through living arrangements. Regarding our LTSS environment characteristics, we used the Neighborhood Social Deprivation Index, which is 2011, to 2015 5-year social deprivation index measure that includes measures of poverty, high school percentage of a neighborhood with their high school diploma or less than high school diploma, non-employment, percent single parent families. And we categorized, we created a dichotomous measure that categorized least disadvantaged, so under the 80th, 85th percentile, and most disadvantaged, so at or above the 85th percentile. And then the state Medicaid HCBS generosity, again, is the percent of Medicaid LTSS expenditures that are allocated to home care services versus institutional services for aging and disability services. And we created a 4-category measure based on quartiles of our sample. And you can see the range between 8.6%, which are typically states, the southern states, and I think the 77.7% HCBS generosity is either Oregon or Washington. And so we used bivariate analyses to compare individual and LTSS environment characteristics and care experiences by the use of paid help, stratified by dementia status. And then we also use within group logistic regressions to examine associations between paid help use, LTSS environment characteristics, and care experiences. And so the statistically significant findings are in red. So this first table presents the characteristics of community dwelling duals with and without dementia who are receiving assistance by use of paid help. So no dementias on the left, dementia on the right. People across both groups, people who were using paid help were older, had more health conditions, were receiving help with more self-care mobility activities, and were less often living with a spouse. The second table presents the LTSS environment characteristics of community dwelling duals with and without dementia who are receiving assistance by use of paid help. Duals with dementia, were more likely to use paid help if they were living in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. This was not significant in the no dementia group. And then for both groups, people in more generous states were more likely to receive paid help, which is what you would expect to see. And so this table presents care experiences of community dwelling duals receiving assistance by the use of paid help. So this sort of top panel looks at adverse consequences due to unmet needs. So people receiving paid help were more likely to experience or any adverse consequences due to unmet need for both groups, self-care, disability, or self-care related adverse consequences for both group. And then for the dementia group, we saw this occurring in mobility related adverse consequences as well. And then for participation, we see that both groups, those who received paid help in both groups are more likely to report participation restrictions. This was specific to going out for enjoyment among the no dementia group and attending religious services, going out for enjoyment, as well as attending club meetings or group activities in the dementia group. And for the sake of time, as well as the size of this table, I'm just presenting the odds ratios for the use of paid help and LTSS characteristics. But we can see that for people with dementia, paid help was associated with being twice as likely to experience adverse consequences due to unmet need. This was not the case in the no dementia group. And then there were no associations found to exist between any of our measures of interest and participation restrictions for either group. And so just in conclusion, the current structure of paid help, if we're focusing on adverse consequences due to unmet need, particularly for those with dementia, the current structure of paid help likely contributes to adverse consequences due to unmet needs. So again, Medicare doesn't cover the cost of HCBS. Older adults have to pay oftentimes for services out of pocket if they are having to be put on wait lists for Medicaid, home and community-based services. And so as a result, low-income older adults who are duals may not be able to afford or get all the help that they need. Findings also emphasize the collaborative nature of caregiving, so between both family caregivers and paid caregivers, and bolster arguments, to develop interventions to improve communication and role negotiation between care team members, as well as support and train paid helpers. The next steps include doing a deeper dive into the LTSS environment. We are also pulling the NHATS unique geolinkages information for the paid help or direct care workforce to look at caregiver experiences as well. And I didn't note differences by race because there were no differences in the use of help, but obviously these care experiences are experienced in different ways across different racial and ethnic groups. So we're taking a look at some either within group analysis or just doing a deeper dive in that regard. And then finally, I was awarded an Impact Collaboratory Career Development Award to actually examine the role of paid aides in care delivery for older adults and the potential for embedded pragmatic clinical trials to improve quality of life for older adults, family caregivers, and paid aides. So that's sort of where this trajectory, is going. And again, thank you for listening, for attending, and thank you to my mentors and contributors and my funding support. Thank you.
So we really have probably just a minute or two. I had asked for questions to be put in the chat box, so I will read Dr. Manley's question. Given the need for policy change, is there a way to benchmark the ORs and effect sizes in your study using dollars saved or other thresholds that would be meaningful to policymakers? And what are the outcomes for your pragmatic clinical trial?
Thank you. Yeah, so there's definitely benefit in thinking about dollars, especially since policymakers are very concerned with saving money. The challenge with HCBS is because it's so state specific, and a study like NHATS, it's difficult to generalize because it's hard to determine where these services are always coming from. We also can't report state specific information, but the work that I'm doing in Maryland does have the potential for that. My Impact Collaboratory Career Development Award is going to help me identify the important outcomes. I will be interviewing providers, family members, people with dementia, as well as insurance providers and Medicaid HCBS program, the Medicaid HCBS program in Maryland for just that reason, to figure out what matters to them. Thank you. And I'm sorry, Iris, I just am now seeing all of your comments telling me to wrap it up.
I thought maybe you did see that. And one last question from Dr. Hill are, what are your speculations for the within group analyses?
Yeah, so I think that we might see, and the reason that I think that there may be some differences is because we know at least caregiving experiences vary by race. So for example, Black caregivers are less likely to report emotional burden relative to white caregivers. I think if we were to look at sort of the adverse outcomes, we might see that Black older adults are using paid help in different ways. We know that they use different types of services. The amount of care is different. The number of hours, for example, that folks are using are different. If we had the ability to, I think it might also be interesting to look at the specific questions related to adverse outcomes. It gets a bit difficult with the sample size, but there may be some differences based on care arrangements, both of coming from those that are providing paid help, as well as family and unpaid caregivers, that might contribute to some differences.
Our next speaker is Dr. Mora Pinzon. She's an assistant scientist at University of Wisconsin. And today she will be presenting the work that she has done titled Motivations to Seek Care for Alzheimer's Disease Among Diverse Populations in Wisconsin.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here today. So I hope we have a very good time with the discussions. The first thing, of course, is my disclosures. I'm supported with a 332 grant from Health Resources and Service Administration that goes to the University of Wisconsin Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. I'm part of this amazing program. And also I have received funds from my department to do this project. So this is probably, I'm speaking to the choir, praying to the choir, that we know that a lot of people, most people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias do not get a diagnosis. And this is worse in communities of color that are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease over the time frame and also more likely to go undiagnosed. But usually we're talking about this with the clinicians, we get into a chicken and the egg situation. Many clinics do not have the staff and resources to diagnose Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So a patient or a person does not get a diagnosis and they don't even know that they need to ask about it. So because there's not the demand, most clinics do not get the resources and staff that they need to diagnose dementia. So we get in this situation where the one thing is used as an excuse to deal there, and we keep going on and so on and so on. So in this setting, trying to define that chicken and the egg, really, who is the chicken, who is the egg, and what starts the problem? That's where my research started, as a way to figure it out. What's the influence of all of the contexts and situations on the healthcare seeking behavior, and how this translates in the subsequent access to healthcare services? So just to give you an example, we might think that, oh, I have some memory changes, I don't know where I put my glasses, I just go to the doctor in that case. This is not how it works. And most likely it's going to be something like this. Memory and cognitive symptoms presents, and most people start to doing something about it. Post-its, reminder, calling my family members, taking supplements, doing different activities. If this continues, the symptoms continue, then they start to evaluate, do I need to go to the doctor? Do I need to talk about this with somebody? And here's where most people think any of this of the following. It's probably nothing. I'm just getting old. I need to keep an eye on my mom, so I don't have the time for this. I don't know if I should mention this at my next appointment. I'll wait if the doctor asks me. This might be just a stress. But even if the decision is like, maybe I should ask somebody, then we start, do I have what I need to ask somebody? Is my insurance valid? Do I have any money left this month to go for this, any extra test that I need? Who can take me there? What transportation do I need? Where do I even have to go? Is this something that I should ask my primary care doctor? Do I even have a primary care doctor? And even after somebody says, okay, I think I should go to the doctor, I think I have the means to go to the doctor, it takes a lot of effort to organize all of those resources and those efforts, and think about time, effort, money, into making an appointment. Calling the doctor, waiting for someone to pick up, waiting to be transferred to the right person, waiting in line, calling back again after your phone drops somehow, giving them all your information, finding the time. And after all of these things happen, you might even go to the doctor. But then we know that all of this is affected by your culture, education, literacy, awareness, socioeconomic, and language. And these changes from community to community. It's not the same evaluation. It's not the same need for resources that happen in every place. So thinking about that and wanting to understand what's the chicken, what's the egg here in Wisconsin, I did this two-part study where we started qualitative to understand what older adults, particularly Latinos, think about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and if they think they should go to the doctor. And then using their responses to modify a survey instrument that could be used at a community level to understand the overall knowledge and awareness and understanding that the communities have. So the first qualitative aspect, here we use card sorting technique, where participants receive in the mail, thanks to COVID, this could be done in person. Participants receive in the mail these cards that has, you can see, very bright colors and the words in English and Spanish. I ask about memory problems, dementia, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, depression. And they were asked to sort these cards in different ways. First question was, tell me which ones are the same or which ones are similar. Tell me which ones are different. Then organize them from most serious to less serious. Then organize them for which of these things would you go to a doctor? And using these cards as a conversation starter. All of these interviews were recorded and then transcribed, and then we use a qualitative content analysis with inductive coding to analyze what the answers that we received. And I think out of these, I think the first and the most important theme for this presentation is it is important going to the doctor. But it was a constant theme. Most people do not refer this as the first option. They refer it as a strategy, something that after everything else fails. And this quote is very appropriate. If you had seen that it happened about a family member that's forgetting appointments, you ask, if you've seen that it's happened once, twice, you have to monitor over the course of a month. If you see that you talk to her and she doesn't remember, then I will advise you to take her to the doctor, check her, take a memory test, see what's happening. I see what's the best way to improve or maintain a certain level and still be lucid. Most participants in the interviews refer something around the lines of, I will give her some of tools, maybe tell her how to write the notes and the appointments in the fridge. And they refer to me also their own tools to stay active and remember appointments. All of the information that we obtain for these qualitative interviews, then we use it to modify a survey instrument called Cultural Beliefs of Alzheimer's Disease, which was developed by Dr. Philip Sayed at UCLA et al. We added questions about health-seeking behaviors using the theory of planned behavior. According to this theory, actual behavior, it has multiple components. And this graph is coming from Dr. Ascent, who is the creator of the theory of planned behavior, and you can find it in his website with additional information. But basically, beliefs inform attitude. The attitude depends how do you think something is beneficial or is harmful. Normative beliefs, how inform the subjective norm. So normative beliefs, what's normal? What do most people believe? How and subjective, how do I feel that the norms are pressuring me into doing something? And control beliefs and perceived behavioral control, how likely I am to feel that I can take control of my own actions and doing this behavior. So just to give you an example that I tell to my students, if the behavior is eating ice cream, what's your attitude about the behavior? Well, I really like eating ice cream. That makes me happy. But the subjective norm when people tell me that I shouldn't be eating ice cream because I have diabetes, so I feel pressure to not do this. Perceived behavioral control, I'm a grown-up adult and I can't control my urges to eat ice cream. There's still the intention. I would like to eat ice cream, but from the intention to the behavior, there's also a distance that's affected by control, and is also affected by how the beliefs and the situation where people live. So this survey that we modified also included some basic questions about knowledge of Alzheimer's disease. We mailed the survey to 750 individuals in Wisconsin that live in diverse areas in Madison and Milwaukee. We particularly target those zip codes and those census tract areas that have more community of color. The survey had $5. There were 3 reminders, and it's also available in English and Spanish. And this was done by the UW Survey Center. So they used the census tract codes in a way that we could get a representative sample of the population. So we mailed to 750 individuals. We just got a response rate of 15.6, which is lower than I expected, but we're still figuring out what happened or how can we make it better. The good thing is that more than half of those responses came from individuals that self-identify as Hispanic, Latino, Black, African American, Native American, Asian, or Native Hawaiian. And the survey had, as I mentioned, it was in English and Spanish. It was based on the best strategies and the best practices on survey research. For example, you see that it has 2 colors. The word that we are asking individuals to answer was underlined, and it was organized in different blocks to allow for participants to really not feel tired at seeing the questions. So what were some of the most important things that we saw here? If you were having memory problems that affected your daily routine, and this came from the interviews, it was obvious that that was a trigger. How likely would you go to see the doctor? 66% will seek help. 33.7% were like, maybe. And just 5% of those respondents say that they will not seek care. And I would like to say, in this sample, 85% of them thought that memory problems are part of normal aging. Even if they thought that it was just normal to forget things, they still believe, they still wanted to talk to a doctor about it. That's important. It's telling me that the chicken and the egg is not really a chicken and the egg. We know where the problem is not at the community level. The problem is not at the person level. There's something else that affects this from happening. So why would people go to the doctor besides getting care, besides getting treatment? It was very important for them to know why, to know the cause. 87% refer that they would like the provider to tell them the cause. And other things that they would like to hear besides treatment is also, I would like you to explain that to my family. Over 60% of them refer that it was important for them that the provider will talk to their family and explain their family what to do now. And they were not as confident that we could do those things, but they thought it was important. So that's the thing. Here's one that tells me that this is very important for them, but most of them think like, I might not get it, but they still will try to go to the doctor. And how easy would you find to seek care from a doctor for memory problems? Here's where it's a little bit over the spectrum, but most of them will say it will be relatively easy. But then we got to a point that there's always self-selection when people decide to fill out the survey. And will I get the same response if I do a different sample size or a different recruiting strategy? That's one of the questions that we still need to answer. In conclusion, it's not a chicken and the egg. We still have that everything around what the community believes around dementia is centered on the person. It's centered of the what the person believes, but it doesn't affect what they that influences when they seek care, but not necessarily the seeking care behavior. We still need to understand more of those barriers that affect the transition from I intend to go to the doctor to I'm going to the doctor and seeking care, but also making sure that if somebody asks their physician, hey, I'm forgetting things, the physician is adequately trained and have the adequate resources to provide the best care possible to this person. There's also a lot of things to understand on how much awareness will change these results. How much will having family members be supportive or being part of the diagnosis process will change these results. But overall, the message is there's many things, many people want to seek care, many people would like to know what's the cause, but there are other things that are happening that are not getting us there. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions now.
Oh, I see a question from Dr. Rigman, so I will read his question. How the perceived availability of effective medical treatments affects one's likelihood to seek assessment for memory problems?
That one was an interesting one, and I only give you a couple of snapshots, but 50% of the people, only 30%, well, let me reframe that. See, about 60% of them thought there might not be really much to do. So, but only 30% said there's absolutely no cure. And even among those that said there's no cure, they still refer that it was important for them to have their family members receive the information on how to take care of them. There was also a few comments during the interviews that they said, you know, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but I would like to make sure that they could do something. And here's where the thing, that something will take many forms, and people want to know, even if they know that there's no cure, they're still looking for something.
Another question from Dr. Johnson. How do you think the concept of familismo affects your patients' self-appraisals?
There's a couple things that here affected. Most of them in the qualitative interviews, it was very important for them and their families. Most of the older adults that I interviewed, they either had, it's important for me that I'm not a burden to my family. I still have a lot of things to do for my family. But then when looking at the quantitative results, most of them refer, if I were sick, my family will want me to go to the doctor. My family will want me to take care of this. So I think the familismo is only, in particular in these questions that we asked, is only supporting going to the doctor. And it was never seen as, because I have my family, I don't need anybody else. It was more seen like, I want my family to have all the information and tools that they need to. Thank you everybody for your questions. And if you need to contact me, I just put in my email in the chat. So welcome any questions, any comments additionally.
And our next speaker is Dr. Cerise Elliot. She is the program officer for this R13. So Dr. Elliot.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to, say a few words of how, we're concluding our R13 conference grant. I'm so happy that, we've been able to keep this cohort together for the last 3 years, and looking at the progress that the 10 scholars have made over the 3 years. It's great. I'm hoping that you were able to, over the 3 years, to experience senior mentorship in addition to peer mentorship. I know that we hope that, you feel free to contact me as a program officer at NIA for your next ideas. The presentations that I've sat through, right, this moment, just the sheer confidence and the growing experience in conducting the research and having data to share, is a great approach forward. And I'm really happy to see that, the group of people that we put together have been able to give you a lot of confidence moving forward. I see there's, hopefully in the 3 years, there's been a lot of growth and a lot of changes. I noticed in the bios, there have been some moves and some changes, and that's all natural. And I hope that everyone is making good decisions as they try to work and do this really difficult study of health disparities, and trying to, in a way, gather the data that there are health disparities, but then also provide the solutions to the policies that need to change and make differences in people's lives. So please feel free to continue to reach out to me and look for guidance. And I apologize that I can't spend the rest of the afternoon with you, but know that I'm very happy for all 10 of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliot. It's truly been a pleasure for us as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Robynn Cox. She is an assistant professor here at USC, at the University of Southern California. And she will speak to us today on the role of incarceration as a risk factor for cognitive impairment.
Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast. I will be presenting joint work with my mentor, Robert Wallace, on the role of incarceration as a risk factor for cognitive impairment. So I first just want to start off by thanking the Interdisciplinary Aging Research to Address Health Disparities in Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias scientific training program, of which I'm a scholar, and my mentor for that program, Bob Wallace. So I'm going to start off by giving a brief background of the topic, then the research question, conceptual framework, followed by the data, the empirical strategy, the results, and then some concluding remarks and policy implications. So over the For over 40 years, the US has participated in an experiment in mass incarceration. Over this time, the number of prisoners aged 55 or older has increased by 400%, and the median age of prisoners has increased from 30 to 36 years. And so each year, as a result of this increase in the prison population, we now have every year, over 600,000 individuals are released from prison each year, and roughly 48% of state prisoners released are age 35 or older. And although 95% of state prisoners are released, there's a paucity of research on the topic of aging and reentry. And so hopefully this paper will help to fill some of that gap as well. So you can see here over between 1993 and 2013, we have a decrease in the proportion of state prisoners less than 40, and increases in those 40 to 54 and 55 or older. And Carson and Sable attribute the aging of prisoners to longer sentences, more time served, and increased admissions among older offenders. And we also see here that there are major racial disparities in incarceration, where Blacks where in the imprisonment rate and also the incarceration rate. This slide shows the imprisonment rate. Blacks are over 5 times as likely to be imprisoned. Hispanics are over 2 times as likely of being in prison. So the imprisonment rate has increased so much for African Americans that a Black male born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison over his lifetime. But at the same time, we have also seen the risk of cognitive impairment is greater for African Americans than whites. Racial disparities in the prevalence of cognitive impairment between African Americans and whites are larger in younger groups as well. And so the prevalence of cognitive impairment among African Americans who are age 85 plus is roughly 2 times that of their white counterparts, while the prevalence is 4 times that of whites for African Americans aged 55 to 64. And so a significant association between incarceration and cognitive functioning could help to shed light on these racial disparities in cognitive impairment, given the disproportionate rates of incarceration among the African American community and as well the Hispanic community and other minority communities. But at the same time, incarcerated people are also a highly selective population that have greater rates of chronic and infectious diseases when compared to the general population, and disproportionately low levels of human capital, and as mentioned previously, disproportionately minority. And so this just shows, looking at the prison population relative to the general population, we see that the prison population has a higher prevalence of having ever had a chronic condition, having ever had an infectious disease, and having HIV/AIDS. And so this is also true when breaking it down by gender. We see that women are actually have greater prevalence of chronic conditions than men, state and federal prisons and also in jails. And the same is true for infectious disease. So incarceration could be a marker of disadvantage that may lead to greater disparities in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. So it could be a marker for disadvantage and so the disparities are actually just due to the selectivity of the population, or it could be that incarceration directly and also indirectly impacts ADRD and racial disparities in ADRD. So my research question here for this paper is whether or not exposure to an incarceration is associated with worse cognitive functioning and cognitive impairment. And the conceptual framework that undergirds this analysis is basically summarizes sort of the points I've made already. We see that the incarcerated population is a highly disadvantaged population with low levels of human capital that reflects that selection. And then there's an exposure to an incarceration, which could lead to access to human capital inputs, which have direct and indirect effects that lead to increases in health and human capital, better resources and improved cognitive functioning. But then we also see that incarceration could decrease human capital through its direct effect on health, as well as its indirect effects through the stigma, disruption in social networks, support, depreciation of human capital, leading to inferior employment outcomes and ultimately limited resources, which could lead to decreased cognitive impairment. And then the direct effect on health is working through channels of chronic stress, exposure to infectious disease, experiencing traumatic experiences, and then chronic illnesses as well. So all of this could ultimately lead to decreased cognitive impairment. So taking sort of borrowing from Finch and Crimmins, from a framework developed by Finch and Crimmins, we could sort of say that there has been this era of mass incarceration that can be viewed as a historical event that has changed the epidemiological environment of those exposed to it, and the impact on the health of surviving members later in life, and to possibly cohort and generational effects. And so contact with this environment should impact health for the duration of life after exposure. And so whether or not this effect is positive or negative could depend on the strength of the protective factors of incarceration relative to the risk factors, but also how the mark of an incarceration might impact one's ability to function in everyday life, because as we saw from the previous slide, there is a stigmatizing effect of incarceration that leads to that impacts one's social network, social capital, so ability to obtain employment, that could ultimately as well indirectly lead to declines in cognitive impairment. Now, although it's not part of this current research right now, I do want to mention that within this framework, it's also possible that we could see impacts of cognitive impairment on those who are exposed to an incarceration through a family member. And so there's been a number of studies that have looked at the impacts of incarceration on close family members, and have found that having a family member incarcerated is associated with increased chronic illnesses related to stress. Having a family member incarcerated is also associated with legal debt and economic hardship. So we could also this would also suggest that the effect could extend to family members as well, although not the topic of this paper today. So the data I use to analyze this question is the NLSY 79. It's a longitudinal survey that has had 28 waves between 1979 and 2018. The initial number of respondents was 12,688, born between 1957 to 1964. Although some of the samples that were collected have been dropped, so the number is lower than that. But the benefits of using this particular data are there's many benefits to using it. One, it includes the cognitive 48 plus cognition module, which they borrow the cognitive functioning scale from the health and retirement study. And so that cognition model begins in 2006. And so by 2016, there were 8,021 men and women who took the cognition survey. Then there's also beginning in 1998, and then again in 2008, beginning in 1998 when respondents were turning 40, and then again in 2008 as they turned 50. They also had health modules, the 40 plus health module and the 50 plus health module. So there's information on health. There's prior health information. They also have questions on ACEs, and they also have questions on, adverse childhood experiences. And they also have questions on premorbid measures of cognition, in particular, the Armed Forces Qualification Test is what I use in this study. So, so the data is very rich. And while there is missing data, I use multiple imputations to impute missing values due to item non-response. And in terms of my empirical strategy, I'm using multiple regression models. I use ordinary least squares to model the cognitive functioning scale scores as a function of prior incarceration and other control variables suggested by the literature that are correlated with incarceration and cognitive functioning, as well as suggested by the conceptual model. And so you'll see when we look at the results that I have sort of what I call a standard model and then a augmented model that includes additional variables that are not in the standard models, what I call the standard models for looking at cognitive impairment. And then I also estimate log odds ratios using logistic regressions and generalized order logistic regression to model cognitive impairment. So in terms of cognitive functioning outcome measures, I follow Otzfeld et al., Lange et al., Fisher et al., and Crimmins et al. And so they have tests on episodic memory, working memory, and mental status. I won't go over this for the sake of time, but it is essentially a scale from 0 to 27 that I create following the prior literature, where cognitive impairment is classified as those who have a CSF score less than or equal to 11. Cognitive impairment, not dementia, are those who have a CSF score that is greater than 6, but less than or equal to 11. And then dementia is classified as those scoring less than or equal to 6. So this is just the weighted average of the cognitive functioning sum score. And we can see here that those who are incarcerated score significantly lower on, have a significantly lower average cognitive functioning score, and this difference is significant. And then we also see here in terms of cognitive impairment, those who are the formerly incarcerated have higher, are more likely to be cognitive impaired. They're more likely to have cognitive impairment, not dementia, and they are more likely to score in the range of dementia, or I should say score in the range. And these differences are also significant. So I'm going to skip through the summary statistics, but you can see here, I have a few slides. There's a wealth of data on here that I have that I'm incorporating into the model. And there are differences between the incarcerated and the non-incarcerated population or individuals, the way that would be suggested by the selectivity of the sample. Though incarcerated individuals are slightly older, they have a higher proportion of Black, Hispanic, a lower proportion of women, They also have a higher proportion of heart problems, high blood pressure, stroke, and emotional problems or depression. They also are more likely to have certain adverse childhood experiences. They're more likely to fall in the bottom quartile and the second quartile for net worth. And then they also have lower levels of education. About 46% have less than a high school education, relative to only about 14% of the non-incarcerated. And they also score significantly lower, as you see on the premorbid test, premorbid cognitive functioning test. So here are my results. And so essentially, this is from the CFS score. This is for the incarceration variable. This is the logistic regression with overall cognitive impairment. So CFS scores less than or equal to 11 are denoted as cognitive impairment. And then this is the generalized logistic regression here. So the first here is comparing being in the SIND category versus normal. The second here is comparing being in the dementia category versus those in SIND and normal. And so as you can see here, the CFS score is, the incarcerated individuals score lower on their CFS score, and that's pretty robust to the inclusion of many controls, and that's what these X's represent, up to the point where we control for the AFQT. At that point, then the differences in the CFS score goes away. For cognitive impairment, once we include education, the differences in the log odds go away. And that's the same for comparing SIND versus normal. For dementia versus SIND and normal, the difference goes away once we include education. So I'm rushing through here, I'm out of time, so I'm just going to give the summary. Although formerly incarcerated people who survived to middle age experience more than twice the rate of cognitive impairment relative to their non-incarcerated peers, these differences seem to be explained by the selection of incarceration. After we control for many factors, the difference in cognitive impairment between the formerly incarcerated and the non-incarcerated is no longer significant. Our findings are consistent with previous research that finds significant associations between race, ethnicity, sex, BMI, vascular disease, some adverse childhood experiences, emotional disorders and depression, and education and premorbid measures of cognitive functioning. In fact, our findings support the cognitive reserve hypothesis. And our study uses highest grade completed as well as a premorbid test of cognition. And using that, we find that premorbid measures of cognitive functioning captured by the AFQT test are consistently more important in explaining cognitive impairment than education levels. And those were some additional tests that I did, just doing simple regressions to see, well, what would totally take away the effect of incarceration. And it seems AFQT, a lot of it is explained in this premorbid measure of cognitive functioning through the AFQT. And so we also find that vascular disease is an important predictor of cognitive impairment, and to a lesser extent, dementia, holding other factors constant. There's also persistence in the difference in cognitive impairment and dementia between Hispanics and non-Hispanic Blacks relative to whites.
The one question that I'll pose to you is, education has been shown to delay onset of symptoms through cognitive reserve. Education seems to explain most of the differences. So does incarceration add nothing to risk?
Yes, so I would say that for this particular sample, we do still see that there's that there's an effect through depression. And so to the extent that that's an indicator of chronic stress, maybe there's some effect there that's related to incarceration. But overall, this may suggest that this is a selection issue, and that these are that incarceration is not necessarily directly influencing cognitive impairment, although this is also a selected sample because you had to have survived to age 50 in order to take this test. So there's some selectivity there, and incarcerated individuals are more likely to pass away.
Thank you so much. This is such an important topic that we don't normally get to hear about. Dr. Susan Flowers Benton is assistant professor at Southern University and A&M College. Today, she's going to share with us her research on the Living Well Together program, a qualitative analysis of a health self-management program for aging African Americans with chronic illness.
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm very happy to be here today and to see everybody and to listen to all of the work that you all have been doing over the course of this program. Before I get started, I wanted to go ahead and thank my mentors in this project. So I wanted to thank Dr. Aranda for her feedback and guidance, particularly on this topic, and also my mentor, Dr. Roland Thorpe, and Ms. Iris for your support during this program too, as well. Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about what I've been doing. So the Living Well Together program, a qualitative analysis as of a self-management program for aging African Americans with chronic illness who are also at elevated risk for memory concerns. And I know that that title is a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm working on it. This is the working title. So I know that a lot of us in aging and disparities research already know the numbers, but for context, I'll just include them here. So aging and diversification of the US population is going to be very important going forward. The number of older Americans is supposed to double by the 2050, and I believe they may have even moved that date up recently. And over half of these people will identify as non-white, right? And so aging and race is going to increase the risk independently and together. They're going to increase your risk for chronic illness and for cognitive impairments. And so when we think about this, 3 out of 4 adults over the age of 65 manages 2 or more chronic illnesses. And multi-comorbidity increases the complexity of managing a person's health, right? It complicates your treatment, it increases the difficulty of managing your health. You have many rules and considerations to follow, and which then in turn increases the risk for negative health and psychosocial outcomes for older adults. And it also increases the risk for later development of conditions like MCI and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So with this in mind, it seems that taking a more inclusive perspective when you're designing intervention programs may lead to better outcomes, especially when you're talking about the combination of age and perhaps disability status, so maybe cognitive impairments, et cetera. So though we're busy working on cures for cognitive dysfunction, right now, the main treatment that we have is our best option also for high quality of life, right? So when you go to the doctor for and tell the doctor that you're having some memory concerns, three of the things that your doctor will recommend to you are improving your physical health. So you want to make sure that if you have any chronic cardiovascular conditions, any metabolic conditions, you're maintaining tight control over those, increasing physical activity, improving sleep and nutrition, all of those things that we all know that we should do. You're also encouraged to improve cognitive health, so making sure that you're staying cognitively active and treating any types of mood disorders, that may have arisen, depression or anxiety, things like that. And then lastly, increasing social support and engagement. So to enlist the help of family members and friends with managing your health. And I have a rehab background. So from rehab psychology, we believe that disability and chronic conditions, illness is always managed within the context of a family. And that family takes a broad definition depending on who you are and what your social network looks like. But your social network can help you with making sure that you're taking your medication, getting to medical appointments. They can reduce isolation, making sure you're getting out into the community as much as you want to, and making sure you're not missing meals. So helping monitor your health. And there are many benefits to improving health self-management, right? For the individual, improving your physical and cognitive health, improving your mood and quality of life, and possibly reducing a risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And then for the family as well, right? So care partners will have reduced care burden, and they may also experience improved quality of life. And then for the community itself, there may be effects on health equity, reducing healthcare utilization, and reducing healthcare costs. So it is a benefit across the board. But as we all know, managing our health is often easier said than done. And even in the best of circumstances, it can be a very complex task. And there are significant gaps. Research has shown that there are significant gaps between treatment recommendations and the daily implementation of these recommendations, right? It's very difficult to follow your doctor's orders. So roughly half of people who are diagnosed with a chronic disease are regularly able to follow their doctor's recommendation. And then cognitive complications. So if you're experiencing symptoms of mild memory loss or some subjective memory concerns, that may increase the difficulty for you, right? It will make it more difficult to remember to take your medication, more difficult to remember where, when the last time you've eaten, to initiate tasks, things like that. And this is both a cause and an effect of inadequate self-management or difficulties with health self-management. And then there are also racial disparities in self-management. So patient engagement in self-management behaviors is relatively low among people from lower socioeconomic statuses and ethnic minority groups. So, and there are many reasons for that, some of which relate to barriers to engagement in behaviors and in programs. And so some of the barriers here that we've listed are different needs and focus for health self-management versus traditional health education programs. So many health education programs, it's found that they focus on disease prevention and not necessarily management of a chronic illness. So kind of the idea that you already have a disease, so there's nothing really there to help you manage that. But that has grown in the past few decades. So there are many programs for managing chronic illness. Then there are some internal barriers. So for instance, one of the big ones is self-efficacy, and then external barriers, right? Socioeconomic, some of the things that we've talked about in other presentations, environmental barriers, and then health status itself, right? It's difficult to participate in a chronic disease self-management program when your health is getting in the way of that. So there are also not only racial disparities in health self-management behaviors, but racial disparities in health self-management and engagement in interventions, so self-management programs. And this is also low from people with minority and low socioeconomic backgrounds. So in order to address some of these gaps, what we have done is we've taken two actually well-validated and well-known programs. The Chronic Disease Self-Management Program is from Stanford with Kate Lorig and all from 2003. And then the New York University Caregiver Intervention, which was developed by Middleman also in 2003. That was a big year for self-management and health. And then we added 3 supportive components. So race concordant leaders, we added home visits, and the addition of a partner. And we asked individuals to participate And we ended up with 3 cohorts. And so just going back for a second to the race concordant leaders, we actually ended up with we had 3 leaders. So we had 2 leaders that led the CDSMP group programs. They were both African-American male. They were community members, both of them living with a chronic illness, as suggested and encouraged by the CDSMP. And then, excuse me, the person, the NYUC leader, or the person that did the home visits, was African-American and female, was also a trained counselor and experience with coping with chronic illness as within the person and also as a partner to a person coping with chronic illness. And this person would lead the home visits. And the home visits were held with both the person and their partner. So the older adult's primary participant and their memory partner. And we ended up with 3 cohorts that attended the 6 chronic disease self-management workshops, and they also attended 6 home visits. I'm just going to call them home visits. These were run concurrently. So while they were attending group, they were also attending the home visits. The group meetings were about 2.5 hours long. And then home visits were usually about an hour, roughly an hour long. And then what we ended up doing was having participant focus groups usually within 2 weeks of the original date was 1 month of the program completion, but we ended up with getting them in faster than that. So, and the people who participated in the focus groups were all completers. So just going back a slide, I apologize. We ended up with 29 older adults. We had 6 to 12 participants in each cohort. So that meant 3 to 6 dyads. And then the age range was between 56 and 82 years old. And these were all community dwelling older African-American adults. For the older partner, the older adult person. Memory partners were actually could have been anyone over the age of 18 who was willing to participate in the program with the person for the entirety of the program. And all of the older adults were diagnosed with at least 1 chronic illness. So this is our focus group information. So we had 1 focus group per cohort. The focus groups were 90 minutes long. They were held at the same location and time frame as the group session to increase people's ability to participate. And we ended up within 2 weeks of the final class date. In our first focus group, the total was 6 participants, all completed. This was the entire cohort. The dyad types were spouses. We had 2 sets of spousing and 2 sets of spouses and 1 set of siblings. And the demographics were racial demographics were 5 to 1. So African-American, we had 1 white participant and primarily female. So most participants, 4 out of the 6 were female and 2 were male. In the second focus group, this is the group we had another, not all of the cohort was able to complete this. So the entire cohort, we did have 6 people who completed and participated in the focus group. In this dyad types in this cohort were also spouses, and we also had some friend groups, which was interesting because we originally thought that it would be mostly spouses or parent-child group. This one was also 5 to 1 African-American, and this was also 5 to 1 female to male. So primarily women participants. And then the third focus group was the largest. We had 8 participants. We had some spouses, we had friends, we had neighbors at this point. And all the participants were African-American and most of the participants were female. So the data was collected and all of the data was transcribed verbatim, All of the focus groups and interviews were conducted by the same facilitators. And so this was the data analysis. So the whole project is a large part of a larger project, and we looked at feasibility, acceptability, and some other barriers and facilitators of program engagement, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to talk about the acceptability of modifications. So we use qualitative content analysis, and we looked at the focus groups, in particular for the questions of acceptability. And then the questions that we were asking, the research questions were, are there changes that need to be made to the program to accommodate African Americans? So for instance, cultural differences or strategies, in particular, the race concordance of leaders, and people with memory changes. So are there changes that need to be made to the materials or the teaching strategies to help people with memory loss who are experiencing cognitive impairments get more out of the programs? And how do people, how acceptable were these changes to the group? And so we analyzed our participant responses over two broad themes, which were program factors and supportive components, but we actually ended up having to break out social support because people talked about it in many different ways. It became kind of a category of its own. So the first one that I'm going to talk about were action plans. The results were program factors. So people talked about, under this category, they talked about action plans, goal setting, the curriculum and the materials, specifically of the CDSMP, and then the class discussion. And so action plans, most people cited this as one of the most beneficial aspects of the program. It increased participant motivation to engage in healthy behaviors. It added a layer of accountability, having those written action plans. It helped them to focus on health goals. It helped them to break down larger goals into less overwhelming pieces, right? Because we all know that when you take it as a whole, chronic disease management can be a huge task. And so breaking that down into smaller tasks was very helpful for participants, which reduced feelings of frustration and overwhelm. And it also gave them a sense of achievement when they could go to class and say that, I'm completed my action plan this week. I set a goal and I achieved that goal. They also talked about curriculum and materials. So they found the book to be a very helpful reference manual and also a tool for improving communications between partners and with others. So they thought that it helped them learn a lot about their condition, and it also gave them tools on how to explain their condition to other people who may not understand. And then class discussions were mentioned as helping to cope with cognitive symptoms. So going over it in class, talking about their symptoms or their condition or the material with other group members helped with cognitive skills. It helped with social skills. It helped them connect physical and mental health, some of the discussions, and they found it to be empowering and boosting of confidence. So especially when talking to doctors and healthcare professionals, they got strategies and information from their classmates on how to approach healthcare professionals with their needs. So here are just some of them. I'm not going to go over this for the interest of time. I'm not quite sure how much time I have left, but action planning, here are some of the quotes about curriculum and materials. These are some of the quotes that people gave about the in-class discussions. So, and again, I think, as Iris said, that we'll be sending out our PowerPoints. So in conclusion, this addressed the question of how to improve attendance and engagement of older African-American adults in health self-management programs and behaviors. It centered the design of Living Well Together centered African-American perspective, which was important for many participants. It addressed gap between treatment recommendation and daily implementation, and it incorporates other elements often considered outside of the scope of what health professionals might treat in the office. And so overall, delivery of the Living Well Together by trained race concordant lay leaders is a promising approach for health promotion in this specific population.
Great, thank you. Dr. Elizabeth Luth or Libby, as some of you might know her, is an assistant professor at Rutgers University. And today she will be speaking to us about her work on social determinants of anomalous dementia classification in the NHATS data.
Okay, so good morning or good afternoon. It's so wonderful to be back with you all and this amazing group of colleagues, and to be hearing about all of the work that everyone's been up to since we last met. As Eunice mentioned, the title of my talk is Social Determinants of Health and Anomalous Dementia Classification in NHATS Data. And I just want to take a second to acknowledge my co-author and mentor from when I was at Weill Cornell, Holly Ferguson, who's in the Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine there. All right, I don't have any financial or other relationships to disclose, but I do want to acknowledge the funding that supported this work from the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Aging, and the National Cancer Institute, and as well as the folks at the USC Roybal Institute on Aging. This gave me a good reason to write this paper, which had been sort of niggling in the back of my mind since I completed my dissertation in 2017. So before I get started, I always like to give a sneak peek of the main findings. So in this case, we found that 15% of older adults had an anomalous dementia classification, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. And that the anomalous classification was associated with all of the social determinants of health, the 4 social determinants of health that we examined in the bivariate analysis and in multivariable analysis, identifying as non-Hispanic Black, having less than a high school education, being dual enrolled in Medicare and Medicaid during any year of data collection, or being born outside of the US were associated with an anomalous dementia classification. So just to take a couple of minutes on background, as everyone in this audience knows, dementia carries with it enormous social costs, both for the person living with dementia and for their care partners. For persons living with dementia, cognitive impairment can mean a reduced ability to participate in decision-making. A dementia diagnosis can also carry with it stigma that can lead to exclusion from decision-making, even when the individual may be able to participate in some capacity. For care partners, dementia caregiving is particularly burdensome. It involves providing assistance with multiple instrumental ADLs and ADLs, often for many hours a week over the course of multiple years. And as a result, this takes a toll on both the physical and mental health of care partners. We're all familiar with the concept of the social determinants of health, including the NIA framework, which is pictured here. But briefly, the idea is that there are social, cultural, and environment and contextual factors outside of a person that influence their ability to access health, and that these work together to result in poor health outcomes. As a sociologist, my work is largely influenced by Bruce Link and Joe Phelan's work during the mid-1990s, their fundamental causes of disease theory, that posits that there are social characteristics that operate as fundamental causes of disease. This means that they have an independent effect on individuals' risk of poor health and outcomes, even when other factors are intervened upon. So for the individual social characteristics that Link and Phelan focus on include socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity. And these are what they posit as the fundamental causes of disease. Socioeconomic status is a particularly important fundamental cause, as experiences of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity are closely linked to socioeconomic status. These characteristics occur in social contexts and result in lived experiences that systematically limit access to healthcare and health promoting resources. Social contexts can include neighborhood segregation, systematic racism, there are many. Lived experiences may include experiences with discrimination in healthcare and other settings, limited access to insurance, healthy foods, or other health promoting resources. And these structural and lived experiences act on individuals, resulting in poor health outcomes, including premature mortality, poor physical health, and compromised mental health. If we take this concept and we apply it to the fundamental causes of dementia, We might take the example of minoritized racial and ethnic status. So individuals experience their race and ethnicity both as individual agents and as the result of social and structural contexts that shape their experiences. So in the US context, this is associated with higher rates of poverty, lower levels of education, residents in segregated neighborhoods. Additionally, structural racism and individualized experience of discrimination act on individuals' opportunities and abilities to access and utilize healthcare and health promoting resources, such as access to experienced and specialist clinicians who may recognize and screen for or diagnose dementia. The downstream effects of these imposed and individual experiences include, in the case of dementia, lower rates of diagnosis at earlier stages, less medication being prescribed, and less participation in clinical trials. So with all of this in mind, we conducted the study with the following two objectives. The first was to document how dementia is classified over time in a large nationally representative sample of older adults. And the second was to examine the relationship between social determinants of health, specifically race, ethnicity, education, Medicare, Medicaid dual enrollment, and immigrant status, and dementia classification. So how did we go about addressing these objectives? We pulled 7 waves of NHATS data, specifically from 2011 to 2017, and analyzed just over 11,200 Medicare beneficiaries that reported at least one dementia classification and had no missing data on any of our independent variables, our social determinants of health, or covariates. So I want to take just a second to talk about what we mean by dementia classification in this context. So the main outcome was dementia classification over time. And the NHATS derives dementia classification. That's the result of the results of several questions and tools that assess cognition. So these include reports of a physician diagnosis of dementia, proxy reports of dementia diagnosis or function, as well as cognitive tests that evaluate memory, orientation, and executive function. The NHATS dementia classification and the way that they put all of these tools together and establish cut points has been validated against the Aging Demographics and Memory Study, or ADAMS. And the result is a 3-category variable that divides dementia classification into either no dementia, possible dementia, or probable dementia. And in this study, what we did was we examined dementia classification for each year it was available and categorized that over time as either consistent, progressive, or anomalous. So respondents with consistent dementia classification had the same classification in each wave of data. So let's say there was, they were classified as having no dementia or classified as having probable dementia every year that they reported data. Those with progressive classification followed a trajectory that we might expect when we think intuitively of dementia progression. So perhaps they started off with no dementia in earlier waves, moved on to possible, and then in the most recent waves of data were classified as having probable dementia. An anomalous classification, which is what I was particularly interested in here, were the rest. And these were individuals who bounced around between dementia classifications in ways that aren't intuitively expected. So an example of this is being classified as having probable dementia in the early waves and no dementia in later waves. And because we know dementia is a progressive disease that doesn't have a cure, we wouldn't expect that somebody would be classified as likely having dementia and then not having it in subsequent years. So this table just provides examples of dementia classification over time as observed in the NHATS data. So for example, someone, having, as I said, having consistent dementia is the top purple arrow, has the same, classification of no dementia in all waves. The second purple arrow shows a pretty typical example of progressive dementia, moving from no dementia to probable over time. And then in the last one, the anomalous, the bottom third of the table, these are the ones that were of interest. And the purple arrow shows something that we might expect, where somebody has no dementia most of the waves, but then they sort of dip to possible dementia during wave 3. What we didn't expect to see are the examples that I talked about, where someone has no dementia and then probable dementia and then no dementia after that. And that's what we were interested in looking at. So in terms of the other measures, we measured, as I mentioned, 4 social determinants of health: race, ethnicity, being enrolled in Medicaid as well as Medicare in any year for which data were collected, educational level, and whether someone was born in the US or not. And then we also controlled for the respondent's age and their sex, as well as whether a proxy reporter had provided answers for the respondent in any year of data. We calculated descriptive statistics and did 2 types of multinomial logistic regression models using consistent as the reference category. So we looked both at bivariate analyses and multivariable analyses. What did we find? So as expected, the majority of respondents had consistent classification, dementia classification over time, nearly 3/4. However, 15% had an anomalous classification, and this was a larger group than individuals who reported progressive classification over time. Those with consistent dementia classification were more often non-Hispanic white, had at least a high school education or higher. They were never enrolled in Medicaid, and they were US born. And those with anomalous classification were more often non-Hispanic, Black, or Hispanic, had less than high school education, received Medicaid at some point, and had immigrated to the US. This table shows the adjusted odd ratios for progressive and anomalous dementia classification for just the 4 social determinants of health that we measured. It also controls for the other models. But as you can see, non-Hispanic, Black, Medicaid, and people born outside the US had between 39 and 104% higher odds of anomalous classification. And those with more than a high school education, with high school education or more, had between 26 and 46% lower odds of anomalous classification. So I just want to spend the last minute or 2 reflecting on what these findings might mean. So the first is that anomalous classification is relatively common. 15% of older adults in this nationally representative sample had it. And there's some possible explanations when we think through this. So the first, it could reflect the nature of cognitive decline. It could be that individuals, that there are dips and peaks in the early stages. And that might explain some of the movement between none and possible dementia classifications. It could be that, this is capturing individuals who score near the cut points. So everything is, every classification has a cut point, and those that are toggling back and forth between 2 adjacent cut points, this could be a reflection of that. Or it could be that, dips in cognition are the result of transient events, such as urinary tract infections that might impact performance on assessment tests. However, within this 15%, this anomalous classification, 15% moved from probable to none at some point, which seems a little bit like it requires a little bit more understanding. And 22% had a different classification every single year that data was available, meaning that they never scored the same way in 2 contiguous years, which also raises sort of a question about what's going on. The other thing we found was that this anomalous classification was differentially distributed. So it was more common among non-Hispanic Black persons, those with less than a high school education, those receiving Medicaid, and those born outside the US. This could be capturing initial changes in cognitive function that lead to an increased prevalence of dementia amongst these groups at older ages, or there could be some systematic bias in the assessment tools that are used that make it more difficult to accurately assess cognition in these groups. In addition to understanding, why high rates of anomalous classification and variation exist, I think it's also, you just want to say a word that it's important to understand the consequences of this classification and its potential effect on persons living with dementia and their exclusion from healthcare decision making. If they have any uncertainty around their health, their cognitive health, if that leads to anxiety or difficulty in planning for and addressing emerging care needs. Uncertainty around their dementia status may also lead to delays in advanced care planning, which then can lead back to exclusions from healthcare decision making. And it's also important to consider and understand the effects of the disproportionate burden among non-Hispanic Black persons and individuals with lower socioeconomic status who are more likely to receive this classification. So that is, I want to thank you
Thank you so much. So the first question from Dr. Aranda is, could there be issues with more mixed dementia cases showing up in the anomalous type category? Racial, ethnic minorities are more likely to be mixed dementia.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and that could be the case. Unfortunately, these data aren't. You can, like, through a very arduous and difficult process, link it to Medicare claims data. I don't have access to the claims data, so we don't know what type of dementia diagnosis they have, but that certainly could be a reason and something I should address in the discussion part of the paper. Thank you.
Sort of looking at it from a policy implication or sort of implications for direct care, based on what you found, what would be some of your recommendations?
So from a policy, I mean, I do think that there's an interesting question about how we use these assessment tools and longitudinal, like, survey data, and if we really need to be careful and make sure that we're not introducing systematic bias, that there isn't, that these tools aren't systematically biased. So that would be sort of a place to start, in my opinion. I don't know that like is setting broad policy, but it certainly is a starting point for how we, policy decisions are made, right, based on recommendations that come from data such as NHATS. So it's important to make sure that that we are collecting as accurate of information as possible.
Thank you. Another question, can you limit the data to those with anomalous diagnosis and answer some of those explanations?
I think one of the things that would be important to look at would be to understand who's in the anomalous category. And, as I said, 15% toggle between these things that we wouldn't expect, which is somebody having dementia one year and not having it the next. But I think that there are probably a lot of people that toggle between the no, maybe, no, that type.
And our next speaker is Dr. Marc Garcia. Dr. Garcia is at Syracuse University. He's an assistant professor.
The title of my presentation is Gender and Age of Migration Differences in Cognitive Life Expectancy Among Older Latino Adults in the United States. Very quickly, I just want to talk a little about some of the motivating factors for my research. As we know, Latinos in the United States are the largest minority group, and surpassed 62 million in 2020. We also know that Latinos have they have accounted for over 50% of the total population increase. However, Latinos have a different age structure compared to non-Latino whites. As we could see here, for Latinos, we see a traditional population pyramid, whereas with the Latinos exhibiting a median age of approximately 29.5 years. However, for whites, we could see there is a much older population with a distribution slightly different than that of Latinos, and a median age of approximately 44 years. As we know, the increases in the Latino population are eventually going to lead to increases in the older adult population. Here we see, for instance, Latinos 65 years and older in 2014 accounted for 8.1% of the older adult population. And these projections are expected to increase dramatically in the future. As we know, Alzheimer's disease, ADRD, is a significant public health concern, and there has been increases in the general population across all age groups. Specific to Latinos, we know that Latinos have about 1.5 times the risk of ADR compared to whites when viewed collectively, that is, in a pan-ethnic group. However, we also know that there are 6 differences in the general population between men and women for the lifetime risk of Alzheimer's dementia. More importantly, what we also know that there are differences in life expectancy among older Latinos in the United States, which is very, very important when we think of the overall burden of ADRD in this population. And again, I just want to further illustrate the differences between Latino men and women. When looked as a monolithic group, we could see the age of this population comes in the middle. But when we look at gender differences specifically, there are large differences in life expectancy. And this is a general pattern that has presented itself since the official life expectancy estimates by Elizabeth Arias and the group at CDC. Some of my own research has tried to untangle this and again, look at the overall burden of ADRD among older Latinos. As we can see here on the left, there are large differences between US-born Latinos and foreign-born. Here we have women and we see similar differences among men in both the number of years spent cognitively healthy, the number of years spent with cognitive impairment, no dementia, and also the number of later years spent with dementia. All of these numbers impact the proportion of later years that an individual could expect to spend healthy, cognitively healthy in this sense. In the interpretation of this here is that US-born Latina women can expect to spend approximately 58% of their remaining years after age 50 in a cognitively normal or cognitively healthy state. We see for the foreign-born large differences in the proportion healthy, and we see the same differences between foreign-born Latino men compared to US-born Latino men. Some more of my research has tried to get at the within group differences, and I have looked at these same categories by educational attainment. These are results for women, and what these results show you is that there are increased returns by educational attainment for US-born and foreign-born Latina women. However, the returns are not equal. And we see differences, also racial and ethnic differences. But here I would just like to focus on the within Latino group differences. And as we could see here, for US-born Latina women with some college and foreign-born Latina women with some college, there are large differences, again, within these groups by nativity status. And I'll come back to that. As I stated, the prevalence of ADRD is 1.5 times higher among US-born Latinos. A large part of this is attributed to Latinos having longer life expectancies relative to non-Latino whites and other groups. In addition, exhibiting a higher prevalence of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, as well as low educational attainment. And in addition, exposure to environmental factors that we know impact cognitive functioning in life. What the current literature tells us is that the observed mortality advantage in life expectancy and mortality, also referred to as the Hispanic paradox, may not extend to other outcomes, specifically morbidity, activities of daily living disability, and as I illustrated, cognitive impairment or cognitive life expectancy in general. Thus, this, summing it up, indicates that greater longevity among Latinos does not necessarily coincide with better health. So additional lives are not, added years of life are not characterized, by a high prevalence of chronic illness, disability, and dependency versus healthy years. Specific to this study, I'm going to use the HRS. I'm not going to go into too much detail for this group about the data. This is my sample, but what I do want to talk about is my conceptual framework, specifically life course perspective of age of migration. As I've shown, nativity is extremely important for differentiating health and mortality experiences among Latinos. And the evidence has largely illustrated that US-born Latinos has health indicative of their minority status, whereas the foreign-born Latino population has exhibited favorable profiles relative to the US-born counterparts, as well as US-born whites. So in a quick sum, where a person is born in the United States versus a foreign-born country, and among the foreign-born population, the age that an individual migrates to the United States is very important for late life health. And the reason it's important because age of migration has been used as a proxy in research to get at types of migration, whether it is occupational labor or occupational migration versus family, the degree of health selectivity among the foreign-born group, opportunities for educational and occupational incorporation into US mainstream societies. And as I also mentioned, exposures to environment and other sources, both in the country of origin and the United States. And here I have a figure that I adopted from Zoya Gurskaya, some of the research she has done on age of migration, indicating the positives and negatives that we know happen within these groups. For instance, those who migrate in early life are not as health selected as those who migrate in midlife. And this is largely because this group's health characteristics reflect that of their parents or those who they migrate with. We also know in terms of negative migration, there is a substantial literature that shows the negative impacts of negative acculturation, particularly with diet and other health behaviors such as drinking and smoking. And also, when we think about social incorporation, it's very easy to see that the more time you spend in the United States, the more familiar you are with US society, and the more, again, opportunities you have to incorporate educationally and occupationally. For this study, by outcome, looking at cognitive functioning, I'm using the modified TICS, which is based on the Langmuir algorithm. And again, these are the social demographic variables included in my study. As we go through these results, I just want to highlight, I really like including this figure here because it's very important when we look at differences among this group. For instance, for an individual who comes at a very young age, the differences in spending 20 years in the United States is vastly different for someone who comes at a young age, those who come at middle life, and those who come in later life. Those 20 years in the United States are vastly different experiences depending on the life course stage of migration to the United States. For this analysis, I use Sullivan life tables. And here, I'm gonna get into it very, very fast. As we could see on the left, this is for women, US born, again, all this is US born Latino, Latinos residing in the United States, with the US born here and the age of migration differences here. As we could see among the early life and the late life, they span the least amount of years overall in a healthy state. And when we look at males, we could see for the early life a similar pattern, right? Specific to gender differences, a lot of research has already documented this, but I, particularly in my own research, have not looked at gender differences. Within this analysis, I will say that for total life expectancy, these are the groups where there were significant differences present. So as we know, with increased age, there are increased risk for ADRD, and you could see the large differences in total life expectancy. Specific to cognitive life expectancies, the differences within these groups in cognitive normal life expectancies are significant between these groups, as well as years spent with CIND, and also years spent with dementia. For Latinos who migrated after age 35, I also found significant gender differences for the same, for normal cognition, for the number of years spent with CIND, and the number of years spent with dementia. As we could see, women compared to men are significantly disadvantaged in cognitive life expectancies. To sum up everything, different cultural, socioeconomic, migratory experiences. In short, different lived experiences have different effects for Latinos, right? We know the foreign born, they may have longer total life expectancy. However, this longer life expectancy, as we could see, does not always coincide with good quality of life specific to this research, cognitive years healthy. And just to summarize, it's very important to identify these different identities by foreign-born status to look at differences in risk for cognition. We know that as far as developing cultural appropriate programs, that not one cookie cutter fits all. And I just want to touch on one thing. This is all pre-pandemic. Moving forward, as we could see from some research that has been published, Latinos, particularly Hispanic, Latinos are expected to experience a decrease in their total life expectancy due to the pandemic. So moving forward, of course, this is very significant. It's not clear how this is gonna play out in the future. However, it's something to keep an eye on, and very much grateful for the funding to my colleagues at McFadden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marc. You were right on time.
Portuguese, I saw that, so I did again.
Any questions? Our first question is, would the process of learning a new language and acculturation add to cognitive reserve?
So those are some very, very important questions. And I think there has been mixed research. Acculturation, we have to be careful with that. I think it's used very interchangeably with incorporation. I use this term when I do adapting the host behaviors, but I think it's uncertain at this point. There are others doing this research on language, and I think it's something that needs to be investigated further. I will say one thing, particularly to my research and those using the HRS, is that other algorithms besides the Linga and the Linga-Weir algorithm have been proposed and have been shown to be more precise in the estimated classification of CIND and dementia among older Latino populations.
Marc, what are your thoughts in regards to perhaps seeing a longer life expectancy because those who are sick return to their country of origin?
So if I understand your question correctly, what the literature tells us, what they define is this is the Simon bias, right? A lot of individuals born in different countries, they come to the United States for occupational purposes, but as they age to the life course, they want to return to the motherland. Statistically, demographers and others in the social sciences, as we may not be able to capture these deaths, they're referred to as, or we refer to them as statistical immortals, right? That to a large extent, we may never capture their death, and they do bias the estimates. Research has shown that, but this doesn't explain some of the differentials that we see by race and ethnicity.
2 minutes for more questions.
And I see David, question for him. Yes, thank you very much for that. As we know, particularly with funding for NIH, this is an important distinction between biological sex and gender. And actually last minute, because of this, I caught it and I changed the title of my presentation from sex to gender, because I am not, or can I, with the HRS, examine sex differences. These are gender differences.
We have one last question. With the pandemic, I believe I saw that females' life expectancy wasn't expected to decline as much as males, and yet the cognitive life expectancy pre-pandemic was lower for women. What would you expect might happen with cognitive life expectancy for women and men post-pandemic?
That's a very good question. I've been thinking about this a lot in my research. As we know, the Latino population, as other populations, have been devastated by the pandemic. Just looking at the national results that we have, and then I illustrated to you some by the CDC, some by the group in Princeton. It's not clear. It's expected to. They've projected, particularly males, to also Latino males to experience the largest decline. But as I shown you, males are largely advantaged in this, in total life expectancies and in cognitive life expectancies. So it's not clear how this is going to play out to be. And we need a lot more data, and a lot more needs to be done, because there are large within group differences when we talk about Latinos using a panethnic label, then nativity status and age of migration status, and we talk about education. There's many factors that intersect to influence and impact cognitive life expectancies across the life course. And right now, I think we need a lot more information to answer those questions, a lot more quality data to answer those questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. David Camacho. He is an assistant professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore.
So my name is David Camacho. I am at the University of Maryland in Baltimore at the School of Social Work. And the work I'm talking about here is some work that I was doing that started as a postdoctoral trainee at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City. Also with Libby on this project in the same department. So shout outs, right? And of course, thank you to my mentors here, Dr. Reed, Dr. Wethington, and our great statistician, Dr. Chuck Henderson, and trying to pay it forward with Kelly Pacheco, an MSW intern who's working with us on this project. In terms of funding, I have to thank supporters for this project. This came from support from CIRAD over at Columbia, Dr. Manley, who I believe is here, of course, appropriate timing. And of course, support from Weill Cornell with Dr. Reed, Dr. Pillamer, and Dr. Wethington. Let's see. All right, so in terms of what I'm talking about here today, I'm looking at the relationship of loneliness and cognitive functioning as a whole. Starting off with, we know that loneliness and cognitive impairment, speaking to the choir here, many gerontologists here, both of these issues have a high burden on systems of care. They impair quality of life, and they are major research priorities here in the United States and really worldwide. One clarification in terms of loneliness, there's a lot of discussion now with COVID-19 in terms of isolation. Here I need to distinguish, I'm not talking about objective isolation, I'm talking about loneliness as a subjective isolation. And that refers to the subjective interpretation, meaning making of the quantity and quality of relationships. So the number, the objective number is not what I'm looking at here. I'm looking at the subjective aspect of that. And in terms of older adults in the United States, we know that loneliness is quite common, somewhere between 50 to 30%, in some unique communities even higher. 10 to 15% of the US adults in general experience cognitive impairments or dementia. One thing that we need to really consider is the presence of diversity. Several prior presenters have talked about this. We know that there are an increasing number of Black older adults, Latino, Latinx older adults. And we also know that current research demonstrates that they are more likely to experience cognitive impairment compared to whites. And some of the literature that exists has identified loneliness as an independent risk factor for impaired cognitive functioning. However, most of the work has focused on majority populations, not so much on Black and Latino individuals here in the US. In terms of the link, it's unclear, but one of the pathways of which loneliness may impact cognitive functioning has to do with stress processes and the impact that stress has on the brain and and contributes to cognitive decline. So current literature that does exist in terms of longitudinal examinations is very limited. We're talking about 5 or 6 articles that have been published, at least based on my review of the literature. And in terms of work that has been done in the US, very, very limited work. So far, I found 2 studies that have looked at this, and the findings are quite mixed in general. One of the issues to consider is that in terms of covariates, in some examinations, they include depression, and in some, they include objective social isolation. So there is a mix here. So this is a critical component. And as I mentioned earlier, Blacks and Latinos are sorely underrepresented, Latinos pretty much not represented. And we have to consider the lived experiences of these groups, and not just from a cultural perspective, but also, as some of you have mentioned, minority stressors, as both of these factors have the potential to impact the experience of loneliness and cognitive functioning. So moving in terms of cultural factors, we think familism, I believe somebody mentioned that earlier, communal cultures versus individualistic cultures can shape the experiences of loneliness and its subjective interpretation, meaning making, stress, impact, and so forth. Similarly, minority stress factors such as discrimination, lower levels of formal education, poverty, limited access to health insurance may limit navigations of healthcare systems and receiving care for both loneliness and cognitive impairment. So what we hypothesized here, we were looking at the impact of loneliness and cognition. We're basically considering that minority stress and cultural perspectives are constantly present. And the work has focused on looking at loneliness and its impact on cognitive decline. We want to look at racial differences as well. So we basically hypothesized that loneliness would be significantly associated with cognitive decline, and that both Black and Latinos would have greater cognitive decline compared to whites with loneliness. The data that we used 2 waves from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. Here, the primary measures we're looking at race, ethnicity, people who are identified as Black, Latino, or white. We focus on using the Felt Loneliness Measure Scale, basically a score from 0 to 6, and the Chicago Cognitive Functioning Measure, which is based on the MoCA, but basically we took the overall scores from 0 to 20 possible top score. We use a general linear mixed model, 24-24 final model participation. And we accounted for age, sex, marital status, education, important health factors, important social factors. Keynote in terms of the health factors, we definitely looked at depression, and we looked at how depression varied by racial group as well. And we included other factors of proxies of objective isolation, including social participation, living alone, and actually under marital status, widowhood would also account for a possible measure of objective social isolation. And in this data, we also considered that some individuals were recruited as the sole member of a household, while in some other situations, there were 2 individuals recruited per household. So we considered individual versus dyad participants. Basic descriptive findings. We have, in terms of looking at racial differences, not surprisingly, Blacks and Latinos had lower cognitive functioning at the first wave. One interesting finding here is that loneliness was more prevalent among Black older adults in this sample. The average age the mean age was 72 with a standard deviation of about 7. And again, not surprising, Blacks and Latinos had lower levels of education compared to whites. So in terms of our findings, in part supporting and not supporting our hypotheses, at wave 3, higher loneliness scores were associated with more pronounced cognitive decline, but only for Latinos, not for Blacks and not for whites. So that's counter to prior literature. And for every 1 point increase in loneliness, older Latinos experienced a decrease of more than half a point in cognitive functioning. So processing and thinking about these findings and what they actually mean, well, first off, we have to try to understand why we found no effects of loneliness and cognitive decline among Blacks and whites. And one of the things that we consider is that the measures that were used for loneliness in prior literature, they tend to use direct measures In other words, measures of loneliness that include the word lonely. If we look at the literature on loneliness, the term lonely is stigmatized in society, in multiple societies. So we have to consider that impact. In our study, we used an indirect measure, so a measure that does not include the term lonely. So ultimately, we may have captured different individuals with experiences of loneliness. Cognitive functioning, we also consider that it may take longer than 5 years across waves to actually capture significant differences in cognitive decline. Also, we consider that our sample was younger than prior literature. For example, one study here in the US, their baseline sample was 80 years old. So we posit that maybe our sample was a little bit healthier overall because of age. We also consider that what we can't capture here, and this has to do with the measurement issue, is the chronicity of loneliness. We don't know when loneliness started. So here we know that based on other literature that loneliness is associated with mortality, earlier mortality. So it is possible that some people have died as a result of loneliness. And these are all individuals 60 years and over. So we're actually capturing or working with people who are survivors of loneliness, and also in terms of Blacks and Latino survivors of individuals who have experienced minority stressors, chronic minority stressors. And we think about, especially for Black individuals here, considering their experiences, crisis competence could be an important piece here. A lifetime of experiencing minority stressors may very well prepare them to be better equipped to deal with late life challenges. And therefore, they're better able to cope with those challenges. We have to consider about also appraisal of competing stresses. For example, for African Americans, where does loneliness lie relative to other minority stressors? For example, second wave data here was collected in 2016. We have to consider the last 5 years have been tumultuous in terms of racism, overt racism. So there's a lot of wondering how certain minority groups cope with loneliness and what strategies they use to cope with loneliness. Let's see. In terms of older Latinos, one thing that I have to point out, based on our review and our understanding, there is, this is probably the first study that actually links loneliness to cognitive decline among older Latinos. And what I want to point out here is that ultimately this is a clinically significant decline. People may experience up to 3-point decrease over a 5-year window, depending on their level of loneliness. And that is, even a 1-point decrease in cognition using this measure would be clinically significant. So it's very, very important. And of course, we have to consider possible explanations, again, having to do with perceptions and understandings of social relationships, aging, and mental health. For Latinos, familism is very, very important. Caregiving approaches are very important. Sure, many of us live in multi-generational households. However, that also can bring in acculturation differences, and perceptions and acceptance of cultural values may vary among US and foreign-born family members. Dr. Garcia, very much in line with your work. In terms of navigation of healthcare systems, speaking about the lived experiences of caregivers, people and their loved ones who feel lonely may have a harder time navigating healthcare systems. They may perceive fewer access to possible caregivers who may help them address health factors, such as, they may limit disclosure of loneliness and cognitive impairment, may be less likely to perceive or receive assessment, treatment seeking, interventions, etc. So there's a lot to consider the complexity of these relationships. Of course, in terms of limitations, we have to address that race and ethnicity. We used a proxy. These concepts do not really encapsulate or capture the complex experiences of minority stress. In terms of medical conditions or health conditions, we control for depression and chronic conditions, but other mental health conditions, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders may contribute to cognitive decline as well. And not to mention here in this, for treatment, for Medicaid, for depression, for example, and other mental health conditions may include drugs that may also contribute to cognitive decline that we were unable to control for here. And along with Dr. Mandy's work, in terms of education, quality and location of where a person receives their education may very well vary and impact cognitive changes. Finally, here, we are able to capture diversity. I say Latinx, I think I don't think, I say it on purpose with the idea of being inclusive of sexual gender minorities. Here, we were unable to capture those experiences or those perspectives. So we're literally looking at self-identified cisgender individuals, biological sex. That's what we're asking here. We're not looking at gender. We're not looking at sexual gender minorities. Finally, in terms of what does this mean in the real world? Well, in terms of measurement and moving forward in terms of clinical research, we really need to look at the different impact of direct versus indirect assessments of loneliness. We need to look at different dimensions of loneliness, the onset, the chronicity, the frequency of symptoms, how people make sense of loneliness, and how they relate it to memory and other measures of cognitive health. In this study, we started off with an overall global understanding of cognitive health, but of course, the next step would be to break it down by individual domain and see where or which domains are impacted most strongly by loneliness. And in theory, we also need to look at objective and subjective measures of stress and how they mediate the relationship between loneliness and cognition. We need to do further work to explore coping strategies related both to loneliness and possibly even early understandings of memory decline, of cognitive, subjective cognitive decline. And in terms of loneliness specific, addressing prevention and treatments in loneliness, unfortunately, very, very limited work has been done with Latinx communities. We need to develop treatments that will address loneliness above and beyond depression. And of course, we need to think about how these are going to work in real world settings. We cannot afford to take a slow approach on this. Yeah, and that's pretty much my presentation. I'm open to questions. Please, happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
I have a question. You've been working in the space of loneliness, social isolation, and even with regards to pain, chronic pain. Given what you've said today, you've made a case for focusing on the Latinx population, not uniquely or just the Latinx population, but you've made a case here for the risk factors related to cognitive decline and loneliness. If you were to put your finger today on a potential intervention, because I know that you have your sights on developing an intervention, what would you include maybe in an intervention, a module, a unit, or something like that? What do you have percolating in your brain?
No pressure. Thanks a lot. Well, one of the things that I think about, and this has to do with your native, or not native, but your family background of Puerto Rico, right? So we've been doing some work in Puerto Rico, thinking about what would work in under-resourced settings, because even then, a lot of Latinx communities here in the US are in under-resourced settings in terms of mental health. So we think of things like different components. In terms of just talking about their experiences, almost psychoeducation to talk about this being an important issue, problem-solving components, enhancing coping strategies to deal with this. So we were talking about, oh my God, what's slipping my mind, but there's a common measures or common core intervention that we were discussing, where it takes from interpersonal therapy, it takes from problem-solving therapy, CBT, it takes important aspects. So we were thinking that this may work with older Latinos with loneliness. And part of that has to do with some of the qualitative work I'm doing now, where we're capturing lived experiences of loneliness. Older Latinos, Latinx individuals are talking about experiences related to COVID, but also these very complex long-term chronicity of loneliness related to romantic loneliness, family loneliness, immigration issues, being in the same household, but being distant, perceiving that they cannot talk to their loved ones. And so there's a lot of nuances in the lived experience of loneliness that we really haven't captured. And the problem here is that most of the work that looks at loneliness or isolation has focused on objective isolation. So we're talking about interventions that talk about putting people together when people are really talking about, I want to address specific issues, specific problems related to the quality of my relationships. So we need to do a better job of developing an intervention that's informed by community members. That's where I'm going next, if that makes sense.
Are there good measures of this concept? From a multi-dimensional, manner? Do you know if they are used in any large surveys?
Yes, so there's the CELSA, that tries to differentiate between family loneliness, romantic loneliness, and social loneliness. And actually, in my qualitative study, we attempted to ask those questions. It's a 20-item, I believe, questionnaire. And our older Latinos were just like, what? What does that mean? I don't get it. No. But then once we started talking with them, oh, it's because my son won't talk to me. It's because the wife is so-and-so. So they started describing different aspects of family loneliness, or my partner is in the Dominican Republic and I cannot connect with him. So they talked about romantic loneliness. So they, based on their qualitative descriptors, we can encapsulate different types of loneliness. The measure really was, it was too much work, too much burden, and wasn't getting at just asking them directly. What's the source of your loneliness? So I prefer just asking, but yes, there are measures such as the SELSA.
Do you think the word lonely has different connotations in Black, white, and Latino cultures?
Yes.
I'm wondering about cultural normative expectations about how old age should be experienced.
Yes. And this is again why I'm doing the qualitative, because I don't feel comfortable intervening without understanding the complexities. And of course, perceptions of the future, perceptions of aging, loneliness as a normal part of aging, expectation to be ill and is just dealing with it, rolling with the punches. And this is, I mentioned coping strategies, that is an important piece. Just last week, I interviewed a woman who said, you know, my life has given me so many, has punched me so much that this issue is just not going to put me down anymore. It's just not going to be the case. So the way they perceive aging, the way they perceive loneliness, depression, and so forth is shaped by minority stressors, lived experiences as an immigrant in this country. So bottom line, yes, there may be differences, and we're trying to untangle that.
Thanks so much for everyone for maintaining interest in being in this webinar. We appreciate your time and your commitment. This is a great testament to the amazing work that's being conducted by our 10 inaugural scholars. And thank you so much for being part of this, this conference.
And as you can see, our next speaker is Stacy Shepens-Nemec. I hope I didn't say your name incorrectly. She is at the University of Southern California and is an associate professor of research. Stacy.
Hello, everyone. There we go. Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to present our work, and I want to thank Dr. Aranda and the fellowship sponsors and our mentors for arranging this opportunity. I will be presenting on digital health technology use by people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, or ADRD, from the perspective of expert stakeholders. A manuscript of this study, which is also supplemented with a scoping review of ADRD technology research, is presently under review for disability and rehabilitation assistive technology. So approximately 50 million people live with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. This number is expected to grow to 132 million by 2050. ADRD jeopardizes health-related quality of life, affecting myriad domains of health and function, such as memory, motivation, and social behavior. Suffering in consequence is meaningful participation in everyday activities, a vital part of the human condition and experience that contributes to life satisfaction and psychosocial emotional well-being. Several evidence-based approaches are available to practitioners to improve functional ability and participation in persons with dementia. The reablement approach to therapeutic intervention, for example, is restoration by doing with rather than doing for, and emphasizes functional ability. Psychosocial interventions can help individuals compensate for limitations. Other multi-pronged methods address communication, skills training for activities of daily living, and physical activity. The focus of this talk, however, is on digital health technology, which has the potential to enhance traditional interventions, leading to improved engagement, participation, and goal attainment in persons with ADRD. In the wake of COVID-19, technology-driven interventions have become vital to individuals' health while simultaneously exacerbating digital inequalities. Older people, especially those with disabilities and from under-resourced communities, have been historically overlooked as target users of technology, creating this digital rift that threatens equal access to health beneficial innovations. The intersectionality of older age and disability worsens the risk of persons with dementia that they'll be left behind as technology developments accelerate. So urgently needed is a bridge across this divide that brings cutting-edge digital health technology to diverse older adults of the ADRD community to enable meaningful activity participation. The present study explores the perspectives of ADRD experts about everyday digital health technology usage by persons with ADRD for activity participation, as well as strategies for successful implementation of this technology in the target group as end users. Using a purposive sampling strategy, we identified ADRD experts by accessing our team's professional network, combined with an online search of publicly available academic, professional, clinical, and community organization biographies. Snowball referrals supplemented these tactics. Enrollment was limited to persons who were English speaking, had at least 1 year of experience in ADRD, and were actively working with the target population at the time. The study featured interviews of ADRD expert stakeholders regarding their perspective on technology use among older adults with ADRD. Interviews were conducted by trained research staff via phone call or video call using a semi-structured interview guide. Queried topics broadly included ADRD population needs, digital health technology use for everyday activities and participation in persons with ADRD, as well as facilitators and barriers of technology application in the target population. A manifest content analysis of transcribed interviews was conducted by 2 independent coders to identify emergent themes from the transcribed interviews. Discrepancies were resolved through consensus with the 3rd analyst. Okay, so moving to the results. 18 expert stakeholders participated. All had 4 or more years of experience with older individuals with ADRD, but most actually had 12 or more years. This figure depicts the breadth of experience and roles held by these experts. All participants held multiple roles simultaneously, ranging from clinical nurses and social work researchers to advocates, to technology consultants, and personal caregivers. Settings represented by the experts span the continuum of care, varying from outpatient clinics, hospitals, and skilled nursing facilities to community centers and home health. Experts discussed several ways older adults with ADRD were presently using or seeking assistance to use mainstream technology for activity participation. Primary purposes included socialization, communication with family and friends, and leisure participation. One expert noted that they were communicating through smartphones, playing games like Words with Friends, and using apps like Facebook. They also noted increased use of wearables and virtual platforms for health management, such as using Zoom to attend yoga class. Other technology-supported activities mentioned included managing finances on websites, accessing online health records, daily life management via digital alarms and reminders, and community mobility like bus transit apps. Experts noted several factors that influence feasibility and uptake of the technology. Availability of support systems, as well as timely and preventive support, including assisting novice users or those with higher levels of cognitive impairment in technology navigation, were identified as facilitators, but also as a broad need. Introducing technology prior to cognitive decline also fostered feasibility. Other facilitating factors included high levels of motivation and interest to use technology and having a clear understanding of the value technology would add to one's life. Challenges, the experts noted, began with sweeping statements about society's limited understanding of ADRD conditions and how that has led to ineffective or unusable products for persons with dementia. One size definitely does not fit all. One expert remarked, the problem stems from failure to involve persons with dementia in co-design and technology development, leading us to design for what we imagine they want and need. Some described inexperienced users' anxieties of breaking the equipment. An expert with lived experience described how his own memory issues can impede technology use. And several discussed cost as a major concern for older adults from lower socioeconomic positions, particularly regarding data access and internet. The experts who were working with people from rural areas emphasized this point, given how much technology use depends on consistent and reliable internet. And for them, most of them were choosing to avoid it altogether. Expert recommendations for technology design centered on simplification. They cautioned how to make technology simple, but not childish, and to balance simplicity and interactivity. Another expert suggested the technology content should minimize the need for abstract thinking, which is a challenge for persons with dementia. Experts also emphasized technology should be designed to serve a meaningful purpose, assisting people with valued activities. Customization can foster ease of use with the caveat that it should not be too confusing for users to accomplish. Experts described instructional approaches they utilize to support learning and functional use of technology by persons with ADRD. Popular didactic techniques included modeling and demonstration with visual aids. Repetition, consistency, and routine also surfaced as key. One expert repeatedly introduces technology to the client the same time of day, every day of the week. Using plain language technology, step-by-step instruction, and simplified content was recommended as true for one expert who wanted to learn his iPhone's calendar app. One expert draws on the abilities individuals are likely to retain despite cognitive decline. Consideration of motivation carried through experts' instructional approaches. If a technology's meaningfulness to activity participation was not immediately apparent, some would first educate users about what the tool offered before advancing to device operation. Another explained making new technology comprehensible by linking it to individuals' lived experiences or what they would likely encounter in their lives. Others capitalized on small group dynamics, scaffolding, errorless learning, chunking, guided discovery, and limiting instructional time. Experts deemed having a technology partner as critical. Such partners are typically caregivers, family members, or persons implementing the technology. The desirable partner is friendly and able to communicate in a way persons with dementia understand. Technology implementation, therefore, must be dyadic and collaborative at the outset. As one expert noted, everything you're going to do is going to be together. But some pointed to the serious challenges poses for people who have limited social support or access to such technology partners. Experts identified several roles of the technology partner, commonly involving them in learning sessions, so the dyad could operate the technology together. Assisting as a troubleshooter minimized users' cognitive load. Experts remark technology partners supplement shortcomings in design features by providing real-time prompting and encouragement. When users have more advanced ADRD, care partners serve as surrogate deciders of what technology would be meaningful to the user and worth incorporating in their lives. Finally, having someone available to monitor use over time was deemed critical, as cognition and safety with use may likely decline over time. The most popular digital health technology being used by people with dementia is that which supports social interaction and engagement in everyday activity. However, our limited understanding of ADRD perpetuates real-world disparities in digital health technology interventions. Experts forecasted that without understanding the unique and varied needs of persons with dementia, technology will remain inaccessible, unusable, or absent in meaning, all factors contributing to subpar technology implementation and adoption. In a complementary scoping review we conducted that is paired with this study, we found that technology, whether mainstream or assistive, that is currently being studied for persons with dementia as the end user are almost exclusively studying technology in white, higher SES, urban dwelling populations, despite the disproportionate risk and prevalence of ADRD for persons from communities of color. This is important because it means that technology that eventually makes it to market for use has been developed by and for a very homogeneous, less burdened segment of the potential end users, disregarding the key socioeconomic factors influential to digital health technology uptake. Accordingly, experts' concerns about presently available technology aligned with trends in the digital divide, particularly for older adults who have socioeconomic challenges and limited resources, as well as those with greater cognitive impairment. Our study evidences a continuing need to expand development and accessibility of digital health technology for activity participation for more biosocioculturally diverse ADRD consumer bases. So in characterizing support strategies, simplicity for ease of use and customizability to accommodate users' unique needs came highly recommended. Involving the just right technology partner to support the person with dementia is imperative. However, not everyone has that support person in their life, and this can also add to the load of caregivers that being a technology partner poses that cannot be ignored. Finally, experts recommended a strong focus on instructional strategies to support learning, motivation, and functional use of the technology. In conclusion, this study has identified a range of practical strategies recommended by experts that may be helpful in supporting older adults with ADRD in utilizing mainstream digital health technology for everyday participation. Much work is still needed to expand implementation of digital health technology's utility to meet the needs of ADRD end users from diverse and under-resourced communities. I would like to acknowledge the grants from the National Institute on Aging that funded my study, as well as my co-authors and my mentor, Dr. Wu. Here are my references, and many thanks.
Thank you, Stacy. I know that you had this idea before the pandemic.
Yes.
And so it becomes even sort of so much more relevant and timely, I should say, given our use of technology. Our first question is, I have yet to find technology that is accepted by those with AD beyond television. Responses range from complete disinterest or frustration with little interest. What digital health technology are they referring to?
So with the experts that I talked to, most were referring to apps on smartphones. Many were just talking about things like Facebook. Some were talking about digital reminders, like just having reminders and calendar apps. And the other thing that they were talking about was that the use of the technology oftentimes was only happening if that technology was used prior to cognitive decline happening. So if they were trying to introduce new technology into the person's life after ADRD had set in, it was more difficult, and that frustration and just lack of interest in it at all was happening. But if a person found it meaningful prior to their diagnosis, that seemed to be what would make it stick.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question. Did any of your participants talk about access to technology for financial reasons or financial ends, like accessing something as simple as, you know, the money they have in the bank, or getting access to benefits?
Only one expert out of everyone talked about accessing banking on websites. So it seemed to be not as popular as the social interaction and communication activities. But what I suspect is what was happening is that the caregivers were the ones accessing financial information but because our focus was on end users being the person actually with ADRD, some of the more complex IADLs like banking and finances were not as popular.
I'm going to read off the last question. Thank you. I have found that from Dr. Johnson, I have found that older adults were forced to use technology more because of the pandemic. Was the tech adoption evenly spread across the different ethno-racial groups?
When it came to the pandemic, just in the research that I've been conducting, not related to this study, but another ongoing study of mobile health technology, there was an incredible influx in everybody being able to interact with me remotely via mobile phones, via tablets. And so far, I've been lucky such that my sample of older adults with dementia has been incredibly diverse. So although the research is showing that primarily white older adults are the ones getting access and ability to engage in this digital world, I haven't had that experience in my own recruitment. So my research isn't aligning with what the trends should show, I would think.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Priscilla Vásquez Guevara. She is an assistant professor at Charles Drew University of Science and Medicine. And today she will talk to us about Accelerometer-measured latent physical activity profiles and neurocognition among middle-aged and older Hispanic Latino adults in the Hispanic Community Health Study.
Thank you so much, Doctora. It's so great to see everyone. Thank you so much for putting this forum together. And I really have thanked the previous speakers, right? Because you've touched on some of this and kind of set the stage, right? So we've talked about physical activity being an important health behavior, maybe kind of sort of one that we only have currently in terms of preventing future cognitive decline or Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And so thank you for setting that up. We know that symptoms of Alzheimer's disease may begin 4 to 7 years earlier for Latinos compared to others. In 2014, there were approximately 13% of Latinos who were 65 years and older who had ADRD, and Latinos are projected to have the largest increase of ADRD as well. We do have evidence showing that physical activity is associated with higher cognitive function. And so this is kind of the research, the body of research that we're currently working with. For this study, as was mentioned, I am using the Hispanic Community Health Study of Latinos, which is a multi-center community-based cohort study I looked at households were selected via a 2-stage probability sample in communities surrounding the field centers. And the field centers were 4. They were in San Diego, Chicago, the Bronx, and Miami. We also have here the coordinating center situated at UNC. In total, the study enrolled over 16,000 self-identified Latino adults, really 18 to 74. There were approximately 4,000 per field center. There was sufficient subgroup sample sizes to support comparisons by the Hispanic Latino background group. We have specifically Cubans, Central Americans, South Americans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans. In my study, however, I look at the entire sample. I don't do a breakdown by Hispanic Latino groups. So for physical activity, these are the 2 measures that I'm using. The first, which is the accelerometer, is what I'm using for the main analyses, and the self-reported physical activity is what I'm using for post hoc analyses, but I wanted to present them to you here. So the accelerometer is a hip-worn monitor that we have a certain amount of data that needs to be collected in order for it to be adherent. So that number is what we use here. That data is what we use here. We then take that data collected and average the moderate to vigorous physical activity engaged in for that week. And I'll underscore the moderate to vigorous physical activity because that's the intensity that I'm looking at for this study, recognizing that we have light physical activity as well, which I'm not focusing on in this study. And we have, within the SOUL study, engaging in light physical activity was much higher than moderate to vigorous. But given the physical activity guideline recommendations, which focus on moderate to vigorous physical activity, that's what I decided to focus on for here to map on to our kind of national guideline recommendations. The self-reported physical activity was captured using the Global Physical Activity Questionnaire. And what's helpful about this measure is that we're able to break down the domains of self-reported MVPA for participants. And they break down to occupation-based, recreational, and transportation-based. And again, this is self-report. For the neurocognition, we have the neurocognitive battery that was administered to participants in SOUL who were 45 years and older. These are the 4 tests here that we are using for this study, specifically domains on learning, memory, verbal fluency, and processing speed. All tests were C-scored standardized. And then we took these 4 measures and made a global cognition score. And these were our outcome measures for this study. We have several covariates that we included in our models. And within the analyses for this paper, we looked at things in crude, right? No covariates. We had demographics adjusted and full covariate adjusted. The demographic adjusted included age, sex, education, years in the US, and Hispanic Latino background. And for the full covariate, that meant we included the demographics in addition to the annual household income, occupation, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and self-reported physical health. For our analyses, we looked at cross-sectional baseline data of 7,672 adults between the ages of 45 and 74 in between 2008 and 2011. To look at the accelerometer-measured physical activity, we use latent profile analysis, and I will explain this briefly through a figure. But latent profile analysis gives us a more in-depth look at the accelerometer-measured physical activity levels. From there, we took the latent profiles that we derived and we used survey linear regression models to then examine the association between these latent moderate to vigorous physical activity profiles with neurocognition. Then lastly, we conducted post hoc analyses. We looked at the average marginal estimates of neurocognitive function by latent MVPA profiles. And we also looked at the self-reported physical MVPA domains for each of the derived accelerometer-measured latent MVPA profiles. So the latent profile analysis, you can do this kind of in a couple of different ways, but the way we looked at it is we looked at the gray boxes here. We looked at age, sex, education, and the wear time of the participant with the accelerometer. And essentially what the analysis are looking for, or the analyses you're running is to look for patterns that exist within the data that is collected based on these variables here. And then we wanted to generate profiles by day of the week. So we have here the 7 days. This has been a kind of established way to look at profiles of physical activity in the field. And so we wanted to the best of our ability, map onto previously used approaches. And through this, in this manner, we are able to look at certain profiles or the way that people engage in physical activity during the week. And I'll have a figure to show our results shortly. But this is kind of how the physical activity, latent physical activity data has been presented. So for our results, so the first step was to derive these profiles, right? And so this is what we were able to derive based on our analyses. And just to orient us to this figure, on the bottom, we have the days of the week, right? Starting with Monday and then with Sunday. On the y-axis, we have the minutes of MVPA for each of the profiles. And on the bottom, we start with 0, kind of this first third is 40 minutes, up to 80, and then 120. And then we have, again, each profile, how much MVPA is within that group. Then here on the bottom legend, we have the red profile, which we putatively labeled, right? So we are coming up with these names. But this red group is participants who engaged in no moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. So just a side note, just recalling that we're focusing here just on moderate to vigorous physical activity. It does not mean that they did not engage in physical activity at all. It's just that per accelerometer data, they did not reach the threshold for these intensities. Then for the next one here, for the orange profile, we determined this to be low MVPA. So we can see that across each day of the week, it is about 10 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. So this is something, looking at our physical activity guideline recommendations, we've pretty much arrived to the position to say that anything is better than nothing. So this is 10 minutes per day is not, it's not bad, but it's that this is the profile that was generated in our analyses. Now for the blue group, this we labeled moderate MVPA, a moderate level or moderate profile. And this one was, I thought was interesting. This one is persons who were engaging in about 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, which really maps on to the US physical activity guideline recommendations. So just kind of a check, to see how we're mapping on to establish guidelines. I thought it was really interesting for us to have derived this profile. And then lastly, for the black profile at the top, this one we have as high moderate to vigorous physical activity. As you can see, it is mostly above 80 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. We see it drop off on the weekend. And just another side note, previous work has shown a profile that is kind of low during the week and then picks up on the weekend. And so in terms of accumulating the recommended 150 per week of minutes of physical activity, that profile has been labeled as the weekend warrior. So we did not see that here. For most of our participants, you do see for most of them like a little dip on the weekend. On this small table right up here, we see where our participants in SOL kind of grouped into. So this was a note using the entire SOL sample. And so we see that for high, moderate to vigorous physical activity, we had about 9% of participants kind of belonging to this profile, which related to 1,171 individuals. For moderate, we see it to be 43%. For low, moderate to vigorous physical activity, 34%, and no moderate to vigorous physical activity at 14%. So yes, so in sum, we derived 4 latent MVPA profiles. For the descriptives, I have the descriptives table split into 2 slides, but just in sum, the no moderate to vigorous physical activity profile, within this descriptively, they were more likely to be older, female, to have held a service or professional technical administrative executive job, and to be of Cuban background. They also have a higher average of depressive symptoms and lower self-reported physical health status. For the high MVPA profile, in sum, they were on average younger, predominantly male, more likely to have had a non-skilled labor job, less likely to be of Cuban background, and more likely to be of a Puerto Rican background. Interestingly, on this next slide, we didn't observe any differences in education, but this is just descriptively, right? And so I'll move into what we found. So for our analyses, looking at the association between the latent MVPA profiles and neurocognitive function, we used that moderate MVPA profile as our referent category. And essentially, we found an association where those compared to those with moderate, within the moderate MVPA profile, the high MVPA profile, so the Black profile at the top with the highest MVPA, had lower neurocognitive function, right? And so this is a little bit different, right? But this is where we caught a signal. We didn't observe any associations within any of the other individual neurocognitive tests. We only observed it with the global cognition score. So then moving into our post hoc analyses, these were the marginal estimates. So here we see kind of each of the different models that we ran, the crude, demographic adjusted, and full covariate adjusted for each of the profiles at the bottom here on the x-axis. So no MVPA, low, moderate, and high. The 0 is here, right, for the marginal estimates. And we just see kind of another way to look at this kind of counterintuitive finding. And so high MVPA had a lower marginal estimate for global cognition. And then the last part for the post hoc analyses, we wanted to take a deeper look into the self-reported MVPA reported for each of these profiles. We see that across each profile, the darkest gray, which was the occupational or work self-reported, was the highest domain across each of them. Recreation was the light gray, which was the lowest for each. And then we have in light blue, kind of the middle kind of domain. And so this just gives us a little bit more of the context for the types of physical activity that participants were engaging in. So in sum, again, we observed 4 accelerometer-measured latent profiles, MVPA profiles among middle-aged and older Latino adults. We did observe the moderate MVPA profile, which closely resembled the physical activity guidelines. Surprisingly, compared to the moderate MVPA profile, the high MVPA profile was associated with lower global neurocognition. And then we observed no associations between the profiles and any individual neurocognitive measures. So this kind of, again, with this counterintuitive result, it really kind of points us to look at more of the contextual factors, some of which we saw with the self-reported physical activity, in that most of the MVPA that participants engaged in was occupation-based, followed by transportation, and leisure time or recreational coming in last. And that's really where we see a lot of maybe the benefits of physical activity, and is engaging in leisure time. And then I didn't highlight it in the descriptives, but we see that, well, I kind of briefly mentioned it, in that those in the high MVPA profile were predominantly male. Those in the no MVPA were predominantly female. So those were kind of just some highlights. And so really this points again to us better clarifying these associations for Latinos. And in turn, we will then be better able to tailor public health messages to this population. I would like to acknowledge the sole participants, my, my research group that I was fortunate enough to work with, the USC Edward R. Roybal Institute on Aging, for all of this amazing work you're letting us do, and then my funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have about 3 minutes or so for any questions that you might have on physical activity that we do talk about and promote so much. So this is very interesting to see where we're thinking that we may need to sort of target our educational efforts, thinking of the leisure. Let's see. I wonder what thoughts you have about retirement, since your findings show more reliance on occupation-based physical activity. From Stacy.
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. I think, well, retirement is a very special time, right? So most activity just kind of goes down. So I think that would be actually an excellent opportunity to kind of step in with our interventions and say like, okay, kind of help transition from a mostly occupation-based, let's assume that's who we're talking about when they have high occupation-based, to kind of transition into more recreation. Right. And so it's kind of like changing our mind about like what retirement is supposed to look like. And just anecdotally, I know retirement is a hard time because people are used to being on the go. And so retirement is just, everything kind of like deflates. So I think that's actually an excellent opportunity for us to come in with some ideas for recreation, physical activity.
Our next question is, because occupation is such a large driver of physical activity, I wonder, not I, but Levy wonders, if occupation is a marker of lower education and a possible explanatory factor in the relationship between high physical activity and low cognitive health, perhaps a marker of lower education?
Right, yeah, so this we tried to, I agree. I think we can, the way I'm thinking about these things is that they're kind of clustering together, right? So we're trying to like piece things apart a bit, but they're kind of grouping, right? So at least to me. And so I think it could be, but we didn't, in our descriptive, again, this is cross-sectional. So we didn't see really differences in education across the profiles. But it's definitely like something that we should look into further, because we know how much occupation is tied to education. It gets a little bit like, tricky with immigrant populations, because they could have had their education in their home country and then you didn't transfer here. So, it's definitely we have to look at it more deeply.
And the last question from Dr. Johnson is, can you speculate on what is going on with your high exercisers?
Yeah, so I think, first, I don't know that we can fully say exercise. So exercise is like a structured activity where we engage in something to benefit our bodies, right? So that's why I didn't want to I wanted to look at what the self-reported looks like. And we see that across all the profiles, the highest domain was occupation-based. So I think that's kind of gives us pointing us to looking at these kind of bigger things, which is occupation and others. I think it presents an important question, at least for me, right? I know people that I love are in that high MVPA profile, right? And so can I tell them like, okay, after you worked, you want to go for a walk? I don't know, so I think incorporating exercise in a creative way is what we need to find out. But I don't know yet what is the full answer to that one.
And our last early career scientist presenter, then we'll have some comments from Dr. Hill, is Dr. Moon out of the University of Louisville. She's an associate professor. Thank you for coming in right at 8:30 and staying with us the whole time, waiting patiently for your turn.
Yeah, I really enjoy other colleagues' work. So again, thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues and my co-authors of the study of this paper, Dr. Sunshine wrote at the University of Louisville, and Dr. Juno Sears at Bowling Green State University, and Dr. Stacy Shipens-Nemick at USC. And also, I feel so grateful to be part of this interdisciplinary aging research training program. I really wanted to acknowledge my program mentor, Dr. Julie Zizimopoulos. We met monthly and communicated through emails, and we submitted a grant proposal. And this is, here is an overview of today's presentation. So recent studies found dementia is a salient risk factors for severe COVID-19 infection, as well as for worse outcomes and increased mortality due to the COVID-19. In particular, with the persons with dementia, this is really evidence that the pandemic has increased the feeling of isolation. It's related to what David really mentioned, but like accelerated neuropsychiatric symptoms of dementia and decreased cognition and communication and increased dependency and activity of daily living. And as you know, early lockdown really reduced access to care, delaying and disrupting assessment, treatment, and other types of care, such as cognitive rehabilitation. And also community-based services such as senior center, adult daycare center, and home health services were also limited. So some caregivers experienced the COVID-19 context as an opportunity to slow down and spend more time with people with dementia. But majority of caregivers perceive their care situation as worsened during the pandemic. So interruption or discontinuation of service with social distancing measures, which really limited access to other sources of informal support, has required many family caregivers to take additional care responsibility. So this has led to increasing caregiving intensity or time spent on caregiving. And secondary caregiver stressors have been amplified, to including financial stress of dementia caregiving due to layoff, follow, and workplace shutdowns, and also emotional and physical strains as well. And also the challenges related to school closures have increased demands on the sandwich generation caregivers. Is this? Okay, so, and in particular, African-American people with dementia at high risk for COVID-19 infection more than their white counterparts, even when controlling for medical risk factors. So these health disparity relevant to the COVID-19 dementia, race nexus really reflect the larger structural racism and systemic issues facing communities of color. As you may know, limited research is available on the impact of pandemic on racial minority dementia caregivers. So separate from the COVID context, Black and former caregivers of people with dementia, they do report more time demanding caregiving situation than whites and less formal help utilization. So importantly, the pandemic has increased racial disparity in marginalized groups of social network. So because of social support from others is really closely linked to health of Black caregivers, their health protective value, Black dementia caregivers can preserve from informal social support has been really threatened. So despite the potential disparity in dementia care among Black caregivers of people with dementia compared with white counterpart during the pandemic, limited research has examined, investigated the impact of dementia care provision on caregivers' comprehensive well-being by race within the context of COVID-19 using US national data set or data study. So our study really tried to address this gap. So guided by stress process model and we utilize data on dementia and non-dementia caregivers from National Health Aging Trend Study is COVID-19 family members and friends data. So given the evidence, COVID-19 conditions have intensified pre-existing inequities in socioeconomic well-being, technology, access to care, and support for people with dementia and their families, and other, potential other health disparities. We have 4 hypotheses. So first hypothesis was that Black dementia caregiver will report the highest level of primary stressors and worse caregiver outcomes during the COVID-19 compared with other groups. And the second hypothesis is that Black dementia caregiver will report more changes in ADL and IADL primary stressors in the direction of more provision of help from pre to during pandemic compared with other caregiver groups. And the third hypothesis that dementia care status will moderate the association between race and caregiver outcomes. So we expect Black dementia caregiver will report more worse outcomes in the face of dementia care. And then finally, we expect the different factors will be associated with the caregiver outcomes for Black and white dementia caregivers. So the current study used the National Health Aging Trend Studies Family Friend Files. The NHAT is you already know, you already heard from other trainees. NHAT is a national representative study of Medicare beneficiaries and 65 years and older based on annual data collection on age-related changes in physical, cognitive, psychological, social function. In 2020, last year, the NHAT conducted a supplemental mail study with Medicare beneficiary who completed around 10 interviews. So also their adult family members or friends who provided assistance to the NHAT participants during the COVID-19 were identified, and they were mailed a questionnaire between last year, July 2020 and January 2021. So data were collected through March 2021. So the total sample size was 2,062. So there was 2,062 family members and friends who participated in the NHAT COVID survey. For our study, we excluded our caregiver who provided care for NHAT participants living in nursing home or other residential care facilities. And Hispanic and other caregivers were also excluded in the current study due to very small sample sizes who reported providing dementia care during the pandemic. So we had 1,462 informal caregivers. We also used a weighted sample for this study. So we have 3 outcomes here. So as you can see, care burden, psychological well-being, and self-rated health. Then we had independent variables here. As you can see, we had race, dementia care status, change in health with ADL and IADL before and during COVID-19, using absolute difference and direction of difference. So absolute difference can tell you the magnitude of difference between or change between, before COVID-19 and in during COVID-19. And direction of difference can tell us the nature of differences. And also we included emotional support to care recipients and caregivers' relationship quality with the care recipients. And as background factor, we had age, sex, education, and relationship to care recipient. And so in terms of analytic approach, first we conducted a descriptive statistics, demographics, and study variable by race, demographic, dementia care status. Then we conducted separate regressions of outcomes like care burden, psychological well-being, and self-rated health by key independent variables. Then we did OLS regression models of outcomes with the differences in ADL and IADL before and during the pandemic, using absolute differences and the direction of differences. And finally, we conducted separate OLS regression models of caregiver outcomes with Black and white dementia. So I'm just showing this, there's a table, descriptive table of proportion and means of demographic characteristics among 4 groups. We have 4 groups here by race and dementia care status. As you can see, the mean age of the group was between 57 and 64 years old. And the Black dementia caregiver group was younger than other 3 groups. And more than 2/3 of participants reported having some college education or higher. And a large proportion of respondents were non-spouses. So most of them were adult children, and particularly for Black caregivers. This is another descriptive statistics by study variable by race and dementia care status. Overall, caregivers had experienced an increase in stressors in relation to the pandemic. Caregivers of people with dementia were likely to report providing more help with ADL and IADL before and during the outbreak than non-dementia caregivers. So related to first hypothesis, as we anticipated during the pandemic, Black dementia caregivers provided significantly more help with ADL and IADL and significantly higher level of emotional support to their care recipients than other 3 groups. And they also reported highest care burden and worst psychological well-being and self-rated health during the COVID-19 compared to other groups. About the second hypothesis, was partially supported. So Black dementia caregivers experience more challenges in help provision with IADL when comparing pre versus during the pandemic than others. And that's the result when we use absolute differences. And regarding the direction of differences, as hypothesized, more Black dementia caregivers were likely to report more help provisions with ADL. Unexpectedly, white dementia caregivers showed significantly more changes in help with ADL pre and to during pandemic. Also, more white dementia caregivers were likely to provide more help with AIDL during the outbreak compared with other 3 groups. So we think it's possible that Black people with dementia may have had lower baseline functioning, health or health-related quality of life than whites before the pandemic, and so requiring help with more basic ADL from Black dementia caregivers. Or possibly the rapid functional decline people with dementia may have been experiencing during the pandemic may explain why Black dementia caregivers reported the most provision of help with ADL, but not IADL.
Dr. Moon, we'd like to have just a couple of minutes for questions, if you could wrap up.
Oh, yeah. So, and then the final question, so we didn't expect an interaction. And then the last hypothesis, we did a subgroup analysis as hypothesized primary stressor resources were associated differentially with the caregiver outcomes for Black and white dementia caregivers. And in terms of absolute differences in ADL and IADL support, significant differences were only observed for Blacks and dementia caregivers, especially with the IADL, and the increase in providing help with the IADL was significantly associated with a more burden, worse health-related health for Black dementia caregivers. And the number in red indicate a unique association among Black dementia caregiver compared with other white dementia caregivers. And I can show you this is with the white dementia caregivers. As you can see, there are some big differences in terms of significant association. So among white dementia caregiver, an increase in providing help with ADL or IADL was not significantly associated with outcomes. For more emotional support, for emotional support, white dementia caregiver reported more burden for greater support, but also better psychological well-being. Which is very different from what we found with Black dementia caregivers. And their relationship quality was associated with a greater well-being and better self-rated health for white dementia caregivers. So we should address some limitation. I can go quickly. So majority of sample was white, yes. And the dementia care status is based on self-report, not clinical assessment or diagnosis. And we use a COVID survey participants help with ADL and IDL before COVID-19 outbreak that occurred before the March 2020 outbreak, so which can be less accurate than current status of health. Finally, we have limited variable, like for example, due to small numbers, we did not include any paid service utilization variable during COVID-19. But nevertheless, our findings, contribute to body of knowledge concerning the influence of COVID-19 outbreak on different racial, dementia and non-dementia caregiver groups guided by stress process model using nationally representative data. We found Black dementia, caregiver experience the highest level of stressor, relatively worse caregiver outcomes than other three groups during the pandemic. Although we did not, find any significant interaction effects of race by dementia care, our findings reveal the significant differences in the magnitude and nature of changes in health provision before, during the pandemic by race and dementia care status.
Thank you. We have time probably for one question.
Here, I have a question, if I may. I'm wondering the role of emotional, I guess the toll of the COVID pandemic on the emotional status. How is that? How do you think that played out during the pandemic in terms of the hands-on care that was provided to the participants? To the
so I think that that's a great question. So emotional support, providing emotional support to caregiver and care recipients, it's like maybe it's really maybe stressful, right? I mean, still providing emotional support, but at the same time, it looks like caregivers get some feeling of rewarding, or so that's how I interpret our results. So
thank you. Sometimes crisis can bring in a reward and time for opportunity. Thank you here.
I want to thank our true last speaker, Dr. Carl Hill, who really is the one who planted the seed within the Institute for this conference to move forward.
Okay, I think I got it. Yeah, so I know it's that time of the day, but just wanted to congratulate everyone on, I think, just a powerful slate of presentations and process of mentoring. It's just that, I was in and out a couple of meetings today, but the presentations that I were able to hear were top notch, and they certainly reflect the ideas that we had when we thought about this type of interdisciplinary training experience. So just kudos to the participants and Dr. Maria Aranda and you, Iris Aguilar, and everyone. I tell you, this was born out of a discussion during the Royable Lecture back in 2018 about how we could do something to get early career investigators some mentoring to help put investigators on their way. And so I'm just really proud of what this has become during a pandemic. We talk so much about resilience and stress and coping. I mean, we're all staying connected during this time and using the virtual platform to do our business. And I really applaud all of that. And so, next steps, I just challenge you to stay together. You're a cohort. Cohort effect has been developed by Dr. Aranda and Iris and so many others. And so what are the ways that you'll stay together and present your work together, or find ways to develop teams, to push this forward? Because I tell you, the Alzheimer's Association, where I work, we're really eager to get findings from researchers so that we can translate them for work into communities, and so we're depending on researchers to do more, to take that next step to help us understand these disparities in pursuit of health equity, right? So staying together as a cohort, and then hopefully at some point, some of you will go on and develop your own training programs for the next cadre of researchers to come along. So continue the legacy, but just congratulations to everyone for making this a huge success, and so happy for the Alzheimer's Association to be a part of it. So thanks so much. And I'll turn it back over to you, Iris.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Aranda to just make some quick closing remarks.
Sure. Thank you so much to everyone. I couldn't have said it better than what Dr. Carl Hill had just said. I want to thank each and every one of the scholars for the tremendous work that you've done in these last few years and the culmination of your presentation today. I know all of us are working diligently to have this work presented and actually published in a high impact journal. So we all cross our fingers that things go well in that area. But I did want to take 1 minute to share some of the great accomplishments that our group has had as a cohort. Okay.
Yes, now we can.
So we queried our cohort a few months ago on the deliverables. As you know, with any type of externally funded project, we live on making sure that we come forward with our deliverables for any project, right? And we have some great news. As you know, one of our goals was that our cohort would submit grant applications to NIH. As of a few months ago, 26 grant submissions were made to the National Institute of Health. 18 of those were actually awarded to the nice sum of over $32 million. 40 manuscripts were submitted for review to scientific journals, 40 in total, and 30 of those were actually published. Others were still in review. 10 of the projects that they worked on are related directly to ADRD. 9 have received career awards or fellowships, and 6 of our cohorts have garnered academic appointments, for example, to the tenure position of assistant professor. So with that, I'd like to end our webinar today, our conference today, and congratulate all of the scholars for the excellent work that has been done. It's been a pleasure as a representative of the USC Edward Roybal Institute on Aging, located in the USC Suzanne Dorick Peck School of Social Work. We hope that we can still be connected in the future, and please watch for any new events that we may invite you to participate again. So thank you so much. Be happy, be joyful, and be well. Thank you.